Hey guys, it's me again. Hopefully you are able to hear this loudly and clearly. And I would have to assume that if you are listening to this video, that would therefore mean that you have already received the emails that I sent out in the last couple of days, which have apprised you of some very significant changes to the structure and the form of the curriculum. However, the content, the substance does not change. The form changes, the matter of delivery. Now, as you are undoubtedly now aware of, at this time, the college has decided, in conjunction with the local Houghton County Community Health Organizations, I'm not sure precisely who it was they collaborated with on this, but they decided that it was in the best interest of the college student community, most especially all of you, as well as the faculty and staff and the community in general, to suspend operations temporarily so as to alleviate the probability of the continuing proliferation of COVID, to mitigate that chance. And we can all hope that that will be effective. I personally suspect that it probably will not change things very dramatically. I'm not going to make any predictions here because I'm not in the business of prophecy. But if you put a gun to my head and said, Jeff, can you predict whether or not we'll be back here in 2 or 3 weeks' time? I would say chances are probably no, we will not. In my experience, just wandering around in the public areas, the places and spaces that I go to, and I'm sure all of you go to here in Houghton County, people don't seem to really take this very seriously, and they haven't really fully assimilated themselves to a method and mode of conducting themselves in public, which is maximally conducive to the mitigation of the threat. And until such time as they do, I don't see this going away anytime soon. And I am absolutely convinced that those case numbers are going to continue to go up, or at least they will not really go down at a precipitous rate until well before the end of October. So even though we have the target date, and it's good to aspire and hope, but the target date of October 12th, again, this is me personally. This is just me interjecting my own commentary here. This is not me speaking on behalf of college. So we'll see what happens. Maybe I'll be proven wrong, hopefully so, for your sake as well as perhaps for mine. But I'm going to go out there and say that from an epidemiological standpoint, and in terms of the modeling and the predictive calculus that they do on these kinds of things, I don't see it happening. But alas, don't despair, because you have YouTube. We all have YouTube. It's not YouTube, it's our tube. Now, we're going to revert to this mode of instruction henceforth, commencing today, which is Friday night, the 5th of September. So this is going to be it, my friends, and well, this is it for the next 2.5 weeks, for the foreseeable future, and conceivably much longer than that. As I said, I don't reasonably expect to be back in the classroom anytime, honestly, before the beginning of the spring term, but who knows? Like I said, anything can happen at any time, and we just have to wait and see what actually happens. But I wouldn't be too optimistic about that chance, that actually happening, where we come back and we see each other again. Hopefully we do, because I really, actually, retrospectively now, I can say this is true. I don't like having to do these videos. I need a live studio audience, and I'm really nothing without you. Right? So you guys make this experience all the worthwhile for me, and hopefully I make it somewhat worthwhile for you. So hopefully there's some measure of reciprocity there. I don't like speaking in front of a camera. It's just it's uncouth. It's not something I'm not particularly well suited to, and I don't particularly enjoy the fact that I'm talking to myself alone in this room. And as you can see, my production values have gone down substantially since the last time I broadcast a YouTube video. This room here, in fact, this house here actually is probably about 1/20th the cost of the market value of the house that I was previously recording in. So my recording studio, as you can see behind me, is much more austere and Spartan than the more ostentatious environments that I was situated in before. However, that's going to change, because I'm actually, not that this really concerns any of you, but I will be back in my more luxurious recording studio next time I broadcast to you, which will probably be sometime in the middle of this coming week, because I'm going to be moving out of here and going back to Detroit in the next couple of days. I got some things I got to close escrow on down there. My girlfriend's there, my friends are there. I got a lot of stuff I got to do down there. So anyways, that's where I'm going to be recording from. Now read the emails that I sent out, and this becomes even more essential now. If ever there was a time that you really need to rely upon the value and the contents of the email, now is that time. If before you didn't take them seriously, we'll begin revising your attitude towards the seriousness of the emails and the function that email has in relation to understanding the course material, because you will not be very well off unless you are acquainting yourself with everything that is contained in those emails. Now, I say this very strenuously and I say it very adamantly, but I also say it with a good deal of prescience, because I've done this before where we've conducted class in an online modality or a virtually online modality, whereby we either rely upon, I have relied upon a website, Moodle website, or we've relied upon something like this where it's a YouTube type video. And in those types of learning instructional paradigms, the value and the utility and the utility function of email goes up dramatically. So you need to be checking your email, and you need to be checking it often. I would say daily. And I know I have a tendency to go on and to elaborate and to be really loquacious both in my speech as well as in my writing. Um, but that's not to say that most of what I say isn't important. Especially, it's more important in the email because I tend to go off on tangents more when I'm talking here, verbalizing things, which I'll probably end up doing tonight, despite my best efforts to the contrary. So I would just say that email has a critical function in relation to your understanding of the course material, more so than ever it did before. So don't shortchange yourself. Don't be doing yourself a disservice, because that's exactly what you would be doing if in fact you decided as of now you're not going to be paying too much attention to the email. So that's the first point. The second point is uh, the the way in which you guys are going to take your exams has fundamentally been altered by no wrongdoing of our own, by no wrongdoing of anyone, because this is just the way things work. And you should actually be glad and secretly, perhaps more overtly grateful to the college for making the decision that they did. I think it was a very prudent decision. I think it was a decision that was based on all the relevant considerations. I think that they made the decision that Michigan Tech will hopefully make very soon, and that they should have already made. And I think the fact that Tech hasn't made this decision, that other institutions and organizations locally have, suggests a degree of callousness on behalf of our brothers and sisters down the street there at Michigan Technological University. And hopefully they amend their position. They also decide to revert to the online mode of instruction, because after all, that's where this thing is really originated from. It's originated from frat houses and sorority houses and all the wild, ecstatic parties that they're having down there, while people are giving complete reckless abandon to the very significant health concerns that ought to modulate the way in which you conduct yourself in public. But alas, we find ourselves again in an online instructional modality. And as such, and I alluded to this in the email, but I'm just going to reinforce this right now, because hopefully my saying it will have greater value to and will resonate more substantially with you than just my writing it and you're reading it in an email. I'm going to say this for the record. The tests, and they may be tests. It may not just be test number one that we have to conduct in this fashion. It may be, as I said, I've been right about this so far. I think I told you guys the very first day that I saw you, I said I would be willing to bet whatever money I got in my wallet, which I think at the time was only about $2.50. But if I had $150 in there, I'd still be willing to bet. I would have made this bet that we would not be in class throughout the duration of the semester. That I told you guys. And for those of you who recorded me, go back. And for those of you who didn't, just trust me, because I remember what I said. I said it was highly improbable that we were going to be here physically in the classroom in CCC Gogabek Mall number 104, the chemistry classroom. I said it was highly unlikely. It was inconceivable that we would be there continuously, uninterruptedly, from the beginning of the semester to the end of the term. And alas, I was right about that. I don't know if I'm going to be right about this, but I suspect I probably will be. So regardless, though, we're going to be doing this for the next couple of weeks. So the first point I already made. The second point is that the exams for you just got a hell of a lot easier. And that's my personal but rather educated opinion, because I've taught both online courses as well as interpersonal physical classes. The class that takes the form that you guys had just previously been exposed to up until a few days ago. And I can say from my own personal experience, both as a lifelong student, because I've been a student for much longer than I've been a instructor or professor, whatever you want to call me, a Jedi Master, And in the course of my student experiences, when I was a grad student and before that, when I was a law student and before that, when I was an undergraduate student, I always thought that it was a hell of a lot easier to take online classes. And some of you are going to say, well, you know, that there's a case to be made on either side of that argument. And I agree, there is a case to be made on both sides. But I think the case for the exams is rather unambiguous, and I think that that's a very easy case to make. And the case is the argument goes essentially like this: prior to the transition to the online mode of instruction, you all had to come to class with the knowledge and the information, the insights and the expertise here in your mind. And you had to be sufficiently fluent with that material so as to be able to recapitulate it in the course of your answers to the essay questions and in the formulation of those answers in a way that actually convinced me very clearly and in a very compelling and clear manner that you actually really did understand and apprehend what you were talking about, right? Now that was all incumbent upon you if in fact you were sitting for a traditional essay exam. You got to the class, and not only that, but there's a time constraint as well. You got an hour and 45 minutes or whatever we had, right? And the pressure is on, right? And so you got to be there, and you're in there, and you got a finite amount of time, and you know you're working against the clock, and there's a lot to write, there's a lot to say. Can you get it all out, and et cetera, right? And this all builds up, and it builds up, and it creates a great deal of anxiety and trepidation and fear. I understand that. Now, with the online tests, all right, here's the way it's going to work. And listen to me and listen well, because the takeaway, ostensibly, I hope anyways, is that this is going to be encouraging for you, right? So these are words of encouragement, whether or not you thought that was going to be the case here. But I'm going to try to encourage you. I'm going to try to inspire you. I'm going to try to make you believe that this isn't actually such a horrible thing after all, even though I know you guys, this is what you live for. You live to come to classroom 104 every Monday and Wednesday, and you just can't bear to be without me because of my charismatic and effusive manner, and you're going to miss me so dearly. And I know that all goes without saying. But no, seriously, I know some of you would actually prefer the direct interpersonal interface. I get that. I understand that, right? It's more engaging, but I'm going to try to keep this as interesting as possible. And one of the things that I've already done, as you can see behind me, is I haven't changed anything about this recording studio, if you will. Happens to be my bedroom, okay? And this is where the magic happens, as I like to say. The magic of learning, of course, right? But in my bedroom, because I'm a historian, because I have an affinity for certain areas of world history, I have historical flags behind me. So before any of you go running off to MySpace or Facebook or Instagram or any other social media feed that you may have available to you and insinuating that, oh, my professor has got, I don't know, racist flags, some flag that has some particular connotation that may be perceived as offensive to some particular constituent minority. Before you go out there and do any of that, right, I suggest that you take a moment, you pause, you reflect, and you listen to what I have to say. First of all, those are historical flags, right? One of these, they're actually both contemporaneous. They're around the same period when they came up with. One of these flags is representative of the European Christian Crusaders, who were crusading and rampaging and pillaging and marauding their way across the Levant, the Middle East, in the 11th and 12th centuries. And the other is representative of the endemic Islamic forces that were defending what was at that time their territory, which is actually now the territory of Saudi Arabia and modern day Palestine and modern day Syria and Iran and Iraq and a whole other places in Turkey as well. But I try to be an equal opportunist when it comes to representing the interests of various historical forces and factions. And for those of you who are even in the least bit interested, and I'm sure none of you are really disconcerted by the fact that I've got these flags behind me, but for those of you who are going to run off and actually report me to somebody, good luck, because those flags have historical significance, and they were not designed or intended or have the capacity, I should say, to offend anyone, particularly not anybody listening to this, because I know there's all 10 of you that will actually view this on YouTube. Okay, so point number 2, though, going back to the point about the exams. And I got to set this up, guys, so just give me the first 20 minutes to do this, and then I'll get into some of the substance here. But I want you to know precisely what it is we are getting ourselves into. Okay, not that any of us really has any choice over it. It's a fait accompli. I mean, there's no voluntary aspect to this. This is mandatory. It's obligatory. It's involuntary, and it's compulsory. But you should know, however, going into this, that the fact of the matter is that the exams are going to get a hell of a lot easier, I think, right? I'm not just saying this because I want to pander to the sensibilities of those who are otherwise concerned about the way in which the instruction modality is going to change. I'm saying this because I really, truly, genuinely, subjectively believe that. Think about it this way: when I give you guys the exam, the way the exam is going to go now, right? As opposed to you come to the class, you sit down, you bust out you knock those questions out as quickly as you possibly can, but you also write as comprehensively as you can. You're going to be furious writing till you got carpal tunnel in your dominant hand, and it's going to suck, and it's going to be hard, and it's going to be challenging, and it's going to be very anxiety inducing, and it's going to be an altogether traumatic experience. Instead of all that, right, what I'm going to do is I'm going to just send an email out, right? And attached to that email will be a Word document. And the Word document will essentially look like this. I have the study guide sitting in front of me, right? That's what I got. I don't have any notes on it, just a blank study guide. And this is exactly what your test, I mean, it's not an exact replica of it, but it's going to look very, very similar to this. Instead of saying study guide, test one, study guide, it's going to say test one, right? And it's going to be the same questions on here, right? The very, not, and some, well, they will be the same questions, right? I'm probably not going to change the wording or the formatting at all, right? Now, they won't be all these questions. I'm going to use my professorial discretion and determine which of these questions I'm going to select for purposes of the exam, whereas others I won't ask you them because I think that maybe we didn't do a very good job at elucidating them in the context of class, but for whatever reason, I'll make the decision. It doesn't matter though. And the reason it doesn't matter is because I'm going to send you this email, probably today's Friday, I'll probably send you the test, all right? The blank Word document is what I'm going to send, right? Okay, I'm explaining this to you because usually I explain this in the preface to any online course that I teach, and I take a long time elaborating on this topic so there's no ambiguity because people tend to be confused about what it is I'm saying, and I don't want anybody to feel confused or any consternation, especially considering how they go about actually interfacing with the test. So this is something that is really incumbent upon you to understand precisely what is expected of you, and that's why I'm going to expound upon this to the extent that I think is necessary so as to ensure that you're sufficiently fluent and lucid when it comes to actually taking the test itself. I don't want there to be any confusion. So what's going to happen here is I'm going to send this out, again, via email. It's going to be attached to emails. It's a group email that I sent out to you guys as a Word document. You're going to download it, right? Whatever. Save it as a Word file. I'm going to give you very explicit instructions as to how I want you to save it, right? So you're going to save it in a particular format. It's going to be history test number 1 and then your name, okay? Separated by the, I got a keyboard right in front of me, whatever that is, the shift and then the thing next to the plus sign. But I'll show you, okay? And minor deviations from the instructions, okay. Major deviations, not permissible, and you're going to lose points for it. But all of this will be, again, explicitly, very conspicuously and very explicitly elaborated in the context of the directions and the instructions for the test itself. So I'm just setting this up right now and giving you some context, and I'm establishing what the ground rules are so there's no surprises when you actually do get that email and you see the test and you can't say to yourself, therefore, at that time, I didn't know what the hell was coming at me, because you will be expecting it because of what I'm going to say. So it's going to be a Word document, and what you're going to do is you're going to type responses. Okay, that's all you're going to do, right? And I'm going to probably send this out on, I don't know, I think this is, I don't want to make any definitive commitments right here and then say, well, you said it in the YouTube video, Jeff, so I got to hold you to it. No, I'm not going to do that, right? I'm disclaiming that right now, okay? But I think I'm going to aspire to send it out this Sunday, which is 48 hours from now. Right? I'm going to send it out probably Sunday, right? And then you guys are probably going to have not much time on Sunday because it's going to go out Sunday, probably afternoon or evening. You'll have all day Monday to contemplate your answers, right? Contemplate/formulate and respond to the questions. Then all day Tuesday, all day Wednesday, and I'll probably stipulate that the deadline for submitting the exam back to me, right, where you've completed it, you've written everything you can possibly write based on how comprehensive and extensive your knowledge is and what that allows for you to write, which is hopefully a lot. You'll have to get that back to me. Email it back to me as a Word attachment, right, with everything that you've written, right? Probably by Thursday. So you'll have Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and it's going to be all day Thursday because I'm probably going to stipulate sometime late on Thursday, like 11:59 p.m. Eastern time, something like that. So 4 days. You're going to have 4 days as opposed to an hour and 45 minutes. Now I submit to you that is a dramatic, substantial, meaningful difference. That is a difference of degree. It's a difference of orders of magnitude greater in terms of the time that you will have available. Furthermore, not only does that alleviate the stress and the pressure and the anxiety and the trepidation that you would otherwise experience, incidental to the fact that the clock is ticking and it's running and the time is running out and you got this much time. But alas, I think the even more convenient and propitious thing for your sake is the fact that you will be able to avail yourself of your notes. I would add the book, but I wouldn't recommend availing yourself of the book because we don't really, as you know, I don't really rely very much on the book. And everything that's in the book is in the notes, and more is in the notes, because everything that I say in class is much more comprehensive than what's going to be in the book, because I tend to elaborate and expound on this stuff to a much greater extent than a lot of the stuff that the book actually does. So rely upon your notes. I would recommend that you exclusively rely upon your notes, because if I see you answering answer the questions where you're just recapitulating verbatim what I say in the slides or just dressing it up and embellishing it a little bit, I'm not going to be impressed. In fact, I'm going to be so unimpressed that I'm not going to fail you just be out of spite, but you're not going to get many points, right? So what I need for you to do, what you need to do for yourself, I mean, whether or not you do it for me, I don't really give a shit, but what you need to do for yourself is to go out there and make sure that you were able to elaborate on these respective subjects that coalesce around the substance of the test in a way that demonstrates to my satisfaction. And you guys know the bar is pretty high when it comes to when I say my satisfaction, right? So you're gonna have to really elaborate, right? When I mean elaborate, when I say elaborate, I really do mean elaborate, right? And I've said this before, but I'll say it again. Because it's especially true now that we're taking an online test, right? Where it's a take-home test essentially, right? You got all the time in the world to work on this thing, so there's really no excuse. There's no excuse for not giving me a very comprehensive answer. The only excuse that you would have, as far as I can see, is to say that, well, you know what, I may have had the time, Jeff, I had the opportunity, certainly, but you know what, I didn't have the resources. Now, if you say that, it seems to me that that would be dereliction on your part, because that would be to suggest that the reason you don't have the resources is because you didn't have the notes, and the reason you didn't have the good notes is because you didn't take good notes, because you weren't there, because you were asleep, because you were scrolling on your phone, or because whatever, right? You just didn't record notes very satisfactorily, and that's why I spent entire, I don't know, 20 minutes on the first day of the first class expounding on the importance and the significance of taking notes in this class. So hopefully I did you that service, and hopefully that will be consummated, that favor will be consummated, or will come to fruition now that you've taken good notes, and those notes will serve you very well in enhancing your capacity to actually functionally interact with the questions that are going to be on this test. Okay, what else do I need to talk about? I've covered the reason why there's historical flags behind me. By the way, the flag, I actually kind of lied. The flag on my left, on your right, is actually the flag of modern day Saudi Arabia. But it looks very similar to a Crusader state flag. It looks very similar to the flag that was being used by the Seljuk Empire, which, and I don't know why I'm saying all this, but for those who are really interested, okay, in this, right, send me an email and ask me about the etymology of the flags and the historical development of them, and I'll tell you all that I know, which is quite a lot. But it's better than having a swastika up there, or a Confederate flag, or the flag of the Soviet Union, or a lot of other flags. And by the way, this is my bedroom, so it's going to look the way it's going to look, and I'm not changing it just because I'm going to be on YouTube, because as you guys know, I really don't care. I just don't care. I care enough to take my job seriously, but that's it, right? If your fragile sensibilities have been offended by the flag of the Knights Templar, then I suggest you develop what's known as in the military as some testicular fortitude, right? You develop that. Right. So what are we going to do today? Okay. What I'm going to do, and this is going to be today, this Friday night, whatever this is, Friday night. Spontaneity with Jeff is essentially going to be the functional equivalent of what would have been our Monday class. Okay, this is essentially your Monday class, right? So this is the benefit of using YouTube. You don't have to wait around to Monday to actually get this information. So you're going to be getting in the course of this, if you stay tuned in, right? And if maybe you want to skip ahead of this because you don't want to listen to the lecture that I'm about to give on the ancient Chinese Zhao Empire. But what you're going to get in this is going to be the information that pertains to the study guide. I'm going to go through in a very systematic manner, and I'm going to talk about the study guide so as to not to necessarily give you everything that you need, because I said explicitly I wouldn't do that, right? Because I don't want to disincentivize the attendance of class. And by the way, if we continue to do this online modality of instruction, I'm not going to be doing study guide review sessions anymore, right? Because all you have at that point, all you have to do is go back to the YouTube video, for God's sakes, right? If you're lacking in something, and honestly, that's what you do for this. I mean, actually, this stuff's not going to be on test number 1. This is all stuff that's going to be relegated to test number 2. So you can't do it for test number 1. With respects to this video, doesn't have that relationship to test number 1, as this video will have the relationship to test number 2. But what you could conceivably do in the future, and what you will hope maybe do, depending on whether or not we actually reconvene before October 12th, is you will go back and you will look at YouTube videos, and you can actually use those YouTube videos and rely upon them contemporaneous with you actually taking the next test. Okay, how's that for making things too easy? Right? You get what I'm saying, okay? And I know none of you are here to actually nod your heads or assent to acknowledge that yes, you in fact do get what I'm saying. But hopefully that message resonates with you. You don't know what I'm talking about. Call me, okay? Call me. Nobody ever calls me. They want to text me, which I think is extremely. Don't text me, by the way. Just don't, all right? Because I have a flip phone. You guys know. You guys seen it. I'm very boastful about the fact that I have a flip phone. It's extremely laborious and very tedious for me to actually have to interface with that in a way that enables me to text you back, right? So email me or call me, right? Those are your options. But one of the things I'm going to do today is I am going to get to the study guide, okay? And this is going to be part 2 of this class, right? Because again, pretend this is Monday, right? The benefit is you're getting this stuff 48 hours before Monday, right? Not quite actually, 40 hours before Monday's class, but still well in advance. What am I talking about? Friday, that's 3 days, 67 hours before Monday's class. And the other benefit is that you don't have to wake up at 7:30 in the morning to get to class on time. And I know some of you actually do wake up at that ungodly, unholy, sacrilegious hour of the morning. And I'm thanking my lucky stars that I won't have to do that either. Because I think I already mentioned this in the video, but I'm going back to Detroit here in about 48 hours. So I can go and be with my girlfriend. Because those of you who don't know, for those of you who haven't been in this before, a long, a distance relationship is very, very difficult to maintain, right? It's not just the physicality, it's other things as well. But that's going to end for me, and I know you're all very happy to hear that. So I had to include that, because I'm sure that just made your day as it made mine. All right. So we left off talking about, and by the way, guys, I got this. I'm not up here playing, Pac-Man or Skyrim or Battlefield or something. I got this. You can't see now. I see that the laptop does a very horrible job of actually rendering this because this thing is emitting light at I don't know the range of the light that's being emitted from this is very high frequency, so it's not resonating with the laptop in a way that actually allows it to render the image very effectively. But just take my word for it. All right, this is slideshow number 3. Okay, this is a slideshow that we were on when I was talking to you guys last 2 days ago on Wednesday, I guess it was. And this is slide number 11. Okay, so we were on number 10, I think is where I finished off at, and now we're getting to number 11. And I'm going to need my notes over here to look at this real quickly. So we talked about the Zhao dynasty, and I left off discussing the nature of feudalism and discussing precisely how a feudal subordinate would demonstrate his loyalty to the feudal overlord, right? And there was a process, and this was known as a process of demonstrating fealty, right? Showing fealty to your lord, right? Which is basically submitting before your lord and showing how much of an abject serf, how a slave and a piece of nothing, worthless piece of nothing, you were in relation to your overlord, your feudal overlord, whether he was the king, whether he was the duke, whether he was whatever he was, right? You're accentuating and emphasizing through the act of, as I said, not lying prostrate, all right, lying prostrate, all right. There's a big difference. That little R makes a big difference between those two words, right? But lying prostrate, so laying face down like I did on the counter, making a fool out of myself in class a couple of days ago, right? That's what you would do to demonstrate your allegiance and your loyalty, and indeed your fealty, your submission to your feudal overlord. Now, one of the things that we talked about in the context of China in general, but this is one of the things that really is a very salient concern for the Zhao, because it's really what precipitated their downfall, was the fact that, 2 facts. China's number one. China's a very big place. All right, it is now. It was then. And the ancillary fact, right? The corollary fact is that because it's very big, what the rulers of China always had to do, and this was no less true in the Zhao dynasty than it was in the Shi or the Qin or anyone else who came before them, right? What happened in the Zhao dynasty, and this is more true of the Zhao dynasty because the Zhao gained more and more territory than many of the dynasties that came before them. The Zhao had to relegate the control and the power and the sovereign capacity to rule. They had to relegate and delegate that to subordinates, whom the Zhao emperors or the kings had to really rely upon and had to trust to a very great extent, right? And so the reason why you have to relegate and delegate, I guess, relegate has a more generic connotation, but delegate is to say that I have the power, right? I have the power, okay? I'm the man, I'm the boss, right? Think of it in terms of the mafia, because the feudal system is very much analogous to the system that the La Cosa Nostra, okay, the Sicilian way, right? The mafia from Sicily, right? It's very similar to the structure and the hierarchy of the mafia, right? You go there if you're a lower echelon functionary. You're a soldier, they refer to them as a frontline soldier, right? You're coming up the ranks. You go there, you pay your respects to the boss, demonstrate your loyalty by going out there, killing someone, ripping somebody off, doing something illegal, doing something which could conceivably have catastrophic results for you, right? But doing it anyways because that's the risk you're willing to take, to risk your life, to show your loyalty and demonstrate your commitment to the boss and to the family and to everything you're willing to swear allegiance to, right? That's no different than the feudal system, right? The idea that you have to demonstrate your complete obeisance before the overlord whom you're swearing loyalty to, right? There's nothing you won't do for the sake of your king, right, or your feudal overlord, right? And it's also similar to the mafiosa paradigm in the sense that when you go before the boss, think about it. It's a patron-client relationship. I'm the boss. I mean, look, I look like a boss. I'm sitting in this chair. I can lean back like a boss. Look at how boss this is. I got these flags, which makes me seem more boss-like. I'm going to be more boss when I actually make my next recording in a much more luxurious boss-like setting. This is kind of an underboss setting, or maybe even a capo setting. But nevertheless, if I'm the boss, right, you come before me, okay, and you say, I've got a problem with so-and-so. So-and-so is harassing me. So-and-so is trying to drive me out of business. They're giving me shit. Can you, oh Godfather, can you do something to remedy this situation? Can you do me a favor, right? You ask for a favor. And I grant your favor. But in exchange for granting your favor, right, you come before me. I'm the boss. I'm what's known as the patron. Okay, right? I support you. I sustain you. I give you something. I give you something, right? I give you protection. I give you security. I do a favor for you, right? And then what do I ask in exchange? I ask you, the client, right? You are my client. You serve me, okay? I ask you in exchange for loyalty. Right, and I will be able to give you orders. I will be able to boss you around. You may come over here and you may sweep my floor. You may do my roof. You may mow my lawn. I don't know what I'm going to ask you to do, right? But you do something in exchange. Now that's no different in principle, right? It is no different principally. It is indistinguishable from the way in which the feudal system operated, either in ancient China or in medieval Europe or in more modern iterations. It is indistinguishable. Okay, so think about in that way. Maybe that's a helpful way to conceptualize this. Maybe it doesn't matter because you already understood it, but that's the way the feudal system works. Now, the problem with the feudal system under the Zhao dynasty, and understand this is a concept that you have to really understand to understand what was the incipient cause of the demise of the Zhao, and that's what we're actually talking about. The fall of the Zhao is on this slide. Again, this is slide number 11 in PowerPoint, slide number 3, slideshow number 3. The fall of the Zhao incipiently traced its origins back to the fact that the Zhao was relying very heavily upon this patron-client system known as the feudal system, and they delegated too much authority to the extremes. And I started talking about this, right? I started talking about this on Wednesday, right? And the nature of empire is such that empire is like a black hole, okay? What do we know about the astrophysical principles of a black hole? Well, you guys know that astronomy and cosmology are sort of the hobby horse of mine, right? And so I like to adduce as many examples as I possibly can that may or may not actually be relevant to demonstrating a particular concept in history. But in this particular illustration, a black hole, it consumes all the matter around it, right? It consumes everything, including light. And that's why it's called a black hole, because light can't escape. The escape velocity of light, 137,000 miles per second or whatever it is insufficient to actually allow light to go back onto the black hole. So once it goes in, it is forever gone. And the black hole accretes more and more matter. It gets bigger and bigger. Its mass increases. And as its mass increases, its gravitational pull becomes stronger and stronger. And it has the capacity to grab stuff and pull even more massive things into it and things that are even further away, right? And it continues to do that, right? So it grows with the feeding, okay? It expands with the eating. It becomes, its appetite for mass and matter and material becomes more and more voracious. And so too is the case with empire. Okay, so I think that that's a very concise analogy, all right, and hopefully it works for you because it certainly works for me. I don't think you have to be an astrophysicist to understand that, right? Because when you think about it in terms of empire, what does an empire do? Well, it gets more and more massive, and the more massive it gets, the more its leaders and its military forces aspire to conquer more and more lands because it emboldens them. It gives them a sense of invincibility, invulnerability, and infallibility. The greater you get, the grander you become, the more powerful the more power you acquire for yourself, the more people you subjugate and dominate and enslave and control. Well, the more you get this sense of invincibility. The more you get the sense that history, the forces of history are compelling you. The forces of fate and destiny and providence, whatever you want to call it, right? That's what's driving you.
And that is an inexorable force, and it is irresistible, and it is invincible. And this happened with the Nazis, this happened with Rome, this happened with Napoleon, this happened with many, many great empires throughout the span and the swath of history that indeed we're going to talk about, and even ones that fall well beyond the history of our period, right? But it is inevitable that they all get to a point where they reach this critical mass. And the critical mass point is the point that the Czar eventually reached, where it became too big to sustain its own bureaucracy and too big to sustain its own capacity to actually effectively rule. What that means is that, especially in the context of, what are we talking about, 2,000 years ago almost, right? In ancient China, whether this is ancient China, it doesn't matter whether it's China, right? But in ancient times, it was very difficult to ensure that you had effective communications with your subordinates. And if you don't have effective communications, and if you don't have really a viable means of ensuring what the subordinates are doing, because you can't superintend them on a regular basis, well, then you have to really trust them. And if they're devious, and if they're ambitious, and if they're inclined to accrue power unto themselves, which invariably mankind is inclined to do this, whether or not you believe in the intrinsic goodness of man, this is something that, if given the opportunity to achieve power at the expense of another, if you thought you could get away with it, well, I think you probably would, right? Unless you're somebody who really is just genuinely an altruistic and honest and decent and honorable fellow. But most of the time, they're not. Especially, that's the problem with power. As I think the maxim goes, and I can't remember who originally says it, doesn't matter what, but absolute power corrupts absolutely, okay? And the more you get out to the periphery of the Zao, the bigger the Zao gets, the bigger the Zao empire gets, the more they expand, the more the periphery, the exterior, the further away the exterior is from the interior, right? The headquarters, the capital, the ruling party, the ruling faction, the ruling leadership. And the more attenuated that connection becomes, the greater the possibility, the greater the probability there's going to be for some insurrection, right? For some rogue provincial governor to decide for himself that, you know what, I'm going to achieve autonomy. I'm going to declare independence. I have the troops, I have the resources, I have the material, I have the land. Because remember how the feudal system worked, right? What does the king of the Zhao do? He gives you land, and he gives you everyone and everything that inhabits that land, okay? And think about this this is a comparative historical analysis. Let's go back to ancient Mesopotamia. Remember what I think it was the Assyrians that did this, right? It may have been the Akkadians, but it was either the Assyrians or the Akkadians in the context of ancient Mesopotamia. Remember how they unmanned their provincial governors? They emasculated the provincial governors, right? They unmanned them, and they rendered them eunuchs. They made them into eunuchs. Okay, what does that mean? Well, I'm not going to get through this in very explicit detail, but you can use your imagination, because that's actually a more effective way of envisioning this. Anyways, a eunuch is a guy who has had his male appendage, his male organ, removed, excised surgically, okay, and brutally and inhumanely, you might say, right? But and then that guy goes out there and he becomes the governor. Now, the Zhao didn't think to do that, okay, because it was contrary to the traditions and the philosophical teachings that they embraced. All right, it was antithetical to their cultural tradition, or maybe they just weren't imaginative to actually think about that. They weren't sufficiently creative, but for whatever reason, they didn't do it. And what happens? Well, the provincial governors, they hunger for power. They yearn for power. Not only do they yearn for power, but they yearn to have that which the king of the Zhao has for himself: a legacy, progeny, children, somebody to pass your power on to. And if you're a eunuch, if you're a man without his manhood, you have not the means by which to procreate. You have not the means by which to reproduce and to create children for yourself, right? And therefore, there's a serious disincentive against actually accruing autonomous, independent power for yourself. Whereas these Zhao rulers did have that incentive, and they did want to achieve individual power for themselves and autonomy from the center, which is exactly what they did. And so what happens eventually is the Zhao breaks off into several constituent subordinate kingdoms that are completely initially they're collaborative, they're cooperating with the Zhao, collaborating with the Zhao. But eventually these quasi-independent states realize for themselves that, you know what, we don't actually need the Zhao anymore, right? We're strong enough, we have enough power, we have enough resources, we have enough materials, enough men. We can go out there and we can chart our own course. We can achieve our own manifest destiny. Right? We could become authors of our own destiny, and that's exactly what happened with these what eventually become the various kingdoms in the Warring State period, right? They become independent sovereign nations unto themselves, and they were former provinces of the Zhao. And the process whereby they became independent is that which I was previously talking about, whereby this empire gets too big, it can't really support and sustain itself because the periphery is too far, it's too isolated. They can't rely upon the peripheral governors and the rulers being sufficiently trustworthy to actually be loyal to the center. And those guys go out there and begin to do their own thing. And that's especially true in this context because the Zhao really relied upon the governors in the Badlands, right, in the periphery around the edges of the empire, more so than the governors in the interior, because those peripheral governors are the ones who were responsible for defending the exterior borders and boundaries of the empire as a whole. That's where you're going to find the most conflict, and if that's where you're going to find the most conflict, that's where you need to ensure you have a concentration of your military forces. And if that's where your military forces are, and those military forces are subordinate to the regional governor, well, that gives the regional governor a very strong, not just an incentive, but the means, the mode, right, by which to effectuate and operationalize or actualize his ambitions to achieve complete independence and autonomy for himself, sovereignty for his state, and create a new state independent of the Zhao altogether. And that's exactly what happened. And then we have what was known as the era of the Warring Kingdoms or the Warring States period in Chinese history. I think the most recent Total War franchise. This is a game. It's related by produced by Creative Assembly. Fantastic series, probably one of the best video games out there. For those of you who are PC gamers and don't know about this, it's probably one of the best kept secrets in PC gaming. Go out there and check it out. And the most recent iteration of that game, and the franchise goes a lot back to I think 2001, is actually focuses on the Warring States period in China. So if you're interested in this, if you want to follow this, want to pursue it further, I don't know, maybe a special extra credit project or something, you can run that idea by me. I'll probably say no because we got to be equal opportunities with respects to this. But look into that. It's interesting. So the era of the Warring Kingdoms, and the era of the Warring Kingdoms is synonymous with this 100 schools of thought. Okay, the 100 schools of thought. Now, what happens here is you have these newly created individual states that used to be constituent provinces of the Zhao, right? And these are warlords, essentially, is what these guys are, right? These are former regional governors that were formerly subordinate to the Zhao. They answered to the Zhao. They were accountable to the king, but they went off and they did their own thing, and now they have their own states. And if you have your own nation, right, it is a nation that is sovereign unto itself. It doesn't answer to anybody else, right? And you are your own man, essentially, right? You become your own boss, all right? As a former provincial governor who was formerly subordinate to the Zhao kingdom. Now, what you find for yourself is that you need some kind of philosophical justification to legitimate your rule, legitimate your reign, and give you some kind of intellectual template to make it seem as though you have a higher right of claim, a higher right of authenticity in terms of your claim to power than you otherwise would. Now, maybe this is counterintuitive, but I think it reminds me anyways, it seems to be very reminiscent of, to my mind anyways, it seems to be very reminiscent of what I was talking about going all the way back when we were talking about historiography, right? The development of the history of history, historiography. Remember this? And I said initially it was this idea that you had Eurocentric history, and then eventually you had the history that focused almost exclusively on the history of an individual nation or a people or a tribe or a culture or ethnicity or whatever it happened to be, and to the detriment of a more comprehensive form of history. Well, that's kind of what this is, right? Before this era of warring states, and indeed before the era of the 100 schools of thought, you had sort of a single monolithic philosophical perspective. And that was, for the most part, it was the perspective that was pioneered by Confucius, who we're going to talk about in a minute, right? So it was Confucian thinking. And Confucian thinking was very pervasive throughout the period of the Zhao, and the Zhao sort of embraced this philosophy. And after that, however, you had all these different kingdoms that broke off, and they wanted to differentiate themselves from the Zhao. They wanted to distinguish themselves from their predecessors. They didn't want to have to embrace the trappings, the vestigial trappings of that which came before them, because after all, they're their own sovereign state now. They can create a new philosophy that is fine-tuned and particularized to their particular interests, right? And so what happens is the Zhao, for a very long time, had a very rigid hierarchical structure of internal government bureaucracy. And to advance in that bureaucracy, to advance up the various echelons of the Zhao hierarchy, it was a meritocratic system whereby the more proficient you were at doing your particular job, the greater the aptitude you could demonstrate at being successful in your particular job, the more likely you are going to be upgraded and promoted to the next position above you. And most of the people who worked in this government bureaucracy for the Zhao were, in fact, philosophers. They were philosophically trained. Now, suddenly the Zhao either no longer exists or it's in the process of decay. Okay, it's falling apart at a very precipitous rate. It's losing territory. It's hemorrhaging personnel, military personnel, government personnel, and these philosophers that were formerly agents and administrators and bureaucrats within the overall the central government of the Zhao, they are seeking employment, and they are seeking employment with these various constituent new states in this warring states period, right? That were former provinces of the Zhao dynasty, right? And now they're their own states. And these philosophers, who formerly were members of the Zhao bureaucracy, they go to these warlords, who are the leaders of these various constituent newfound states, and they say, "I'm a philosopher." And the ruler of the state says, "Okay, what a concern is that to me? I don't care. I'm a warlord. What difference does it make? What can I do with you?" And the philosopher says, "Here's what you can do. You can differentiate yourself from the Zhao, because I can create for you a new way of thinking about the world, a new philosophical perspective, a new way of interpreting the world around us, so as to reinforce your right to rule, whoever you happen to be, whichever particular new kingdom you happen to be, right? And most importantly, though, to distinguish you from the Zhao, to say that you are not going to embrace the philosophical precepts that defined the Zhao as a state, as a sovereign entity. And you're going to be charting a new course which differentiates you philosophically and intellectually from that which came before. And the more different you look, well, the more likely people are going to take you seriously, because they're not going to say, "Well, you're just a mini version of the Zhao. You're just a sort of a mini me, right? You're a version of what came before you, but you're not very good at it, and you're not as strong, and you're not as big, and you're just usurping their philosophical ideas." So what happens is all these philosophers who used to be in the bureaucracy of the Zhao, they go out, they're scattered into the wind, and they go to these various individual states, and they find patrons. Okay, they find supporters. They find supporters in the warlords who rule over these states, who then subsidize their philosophical writings and their thinkings and their speeches, and they write and they speak and they think in a way that is consistent with advancing the interests of the ruler of these constituent states. And each one of these constituent states is mostly at war with the others around it, right? So there's very few alliances. They're trying to aggregate as much territory, as much power, as much control as they possibly can, and they're at war with each other. Not just a war of weapons and of men and of materials, but also a war of ideas. And in a war of ideas, you need to have an ideology. And it is central to the purpose of creating an ideology to create a philosophical template upon which that ideology can be based and inspired with or by. And so henceforth, you have these philosophers, and they find these states, and they come up with all these various different ideas, and you have many, many different ways of thinking that begin to proliferate all across what used to be this very sort of monolithic intellectual paradigm, where there was sort of one school of thought, right? Because it was associated with the one empire, the one nation, the Zhao dynasty, that was ruling all these territories. And now there's disparate territories, and so there's disparate philosophies. Okay, which leads us to, all right, I guess I got to use my mouse, and I don't even know why I'm doing this, because it's not that you guys can even appreciate what I'm looking at over here. I got this for myself. This is really for me more so than for you guys. We come to Confucius. Now, so this is advancing, right? So I should have said this before, but this is probably apparent to you by now. You should have the slides in front of you. If you don't print them off, then have your laptop or hopefully you're sitting in front of your PC anyways, and you can just bifurcate the screen, and you can have, half of me in the YouTube video on one side of the screen, and the other half will be your PowerPoint program. But I would recommend that you open this up so you can see what it is I'm actually talking about, and therefore refer visually to the aids that I'm going to be relying upon when I actually go through and I elaborate on these various topics. Because otherwise you'd be doing yourself a disservice, and I don't want that to happen to anyone. So slide number 12. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Confucius. Right. So Confucius was the originator, as far as I know, and I've studied philosophy just almost as long as I studied history. Well, let's say he's one of the originators, but I think he's probably the prime originator of what eventually became known as humanism. Okay, now humanism is a form of philosophy, and humanism essentially it presupposes certain things about humanity. All right, it presupposes, number one, that human beings are fundamentally good,
that we're altruistic, we're caring, we're compassionate, we're considerate, we're selfless. We give fair, due, just, equitable consideration of the needs of others. We oftentimes put the needs of others ahead of ourselves, or at least at parity with ourselves. And humanism encourages people to go out there and to embrace these values, because it says being a kind, generous, gracious, altruistic person is being a virtuous and an honorable and a dignified person. And if you presuppose this about everybody, then it works. Okay, that I mean this calculus works if you assume. Okay, and this is a big if, because this is sort of a contingent thing that you have to assume. If you assume that everybody else out there is just like you, right? And this goes back to the golden rule. I think I already alluded to this earlier in our conversation about some other things on Wednesday, but I said the golden rule had its origins in the teachings of Confucius, right? In the Analects of Confucius, Confucius essentially says, I think ad nauseum, he says something to the effect of, "Do unto others that which you would want them to do unto you." So there's this fundamental sense of reciprocity, that human interaction should be fundamentally governed by a notion of reciprocity, that you go out there and you do good unto somebody, and that good is going to be returned unto you in equal measure. Now, what does that sound like? I mean, it sounds like the golden rule. It sounds like what Maimonides was talking about back in Babylon. It sounds like something that you've probably been taught since you were a very young person, that has been inculcated in you. It has been inextricably associated with the Judeo-Christian traditions. Well, yes, it is. But before that, before Judeo-Christianity really existed, or before it really took any of its more current form, this was a rule or a bylaw, an axiom that was promulgated by Confucius, right? So we have him to thank for this. Now, what is this? What is this reminiscent of? Right? What is this reminiscent of? This idea that I'm going to refrain from doing things that would be considered to be reprehensible to others, right? I'm going to refrain from doing those things because I would not want somebody doing that unto me, right? I'm going to refrain from doing that which I would find to be repugnant to my sensibilities. I'm going to refrain from doing that unto somebody else, right? And hope that they will refrain likewise, similarly, from restraining themselves from doing that to me if I don't do that to them, right? Or I will do good things to that other person, and therefore they will reciprocate and they will do good things unto me. Well, what does that sound like? I'll give you a hint. It's about three slides ago. It sounds to me like this is sort of a reiteration, slight reconfiguration semantically of the yin and the yang, right? What was the yin and the yang all about? It was about balance. It was about achieving some kind of metaphysical equilibrium in life, right? It was a metaphorical representation of the kind of equilibrium that you should strive for in life. That you should have, don't be too aggressive, right? Have your aggression and your impetuosity and your assertiveness, have that all be modulated and tempered by your capacity for introspective thought, by your inclination towards philosophical discourse, by your capacity to engage with others dialectically and resolve your problems congenially, right? I mean, but you have to take both, right? And so the idea that we have this relationship with other people, which is governed by reciprocal rules, whereby I do unto somebody else, and that is going to be done unto me, is in some ways, I think it's evocative of the concept of the yin and the yang. And I would say even more so, actually, following this thought even further down the rabbit hole here, the philosophical rabbit hole, is to say that it's even more analogous to something that we talked about before, which is this idea of karma. Okay, this sounds to me to be somewhat similar to karma. And one of the points that I want you guys to really assimilate yourself to in the course of this class is the idea that much of what we're going to talk about, even though it's dissociated in terms of time and across space, right, geographical space and eons of time, many of these ideas, these philosophical ideas, and many of these historical cycles that perpetuate themselves in history are similar, and you can cross-reference these things throughout time and throughout place. And what I'm trying to do for you is I'm trying to get you to think about this in a way which enables you to say, look at Confucianism, look at humanism, for instance, and say, that sounds similar to something that we were talking about. We were talking about something in the context of ancient India, and they were talking about karma and dharma and how to live a good life and how to achieve equilibrium, how to achieve balance, and this notion of reincarnation. And reincarnation was going to be predicated on how well you behave yourself in this life, or how well you did not behave yourself in this life, right? And so that too had a reciprocal function to it. So I think that the problem with humanism is that it only works
if, in fact, it is the case that the presupposition that you originally start with, that everybody's going to be good and honest and genuine and altruistic and fair and compassionate and all this, if you assume that, then by all means, Confucianism does work, right? Because you go out there and you never lock your door at night, right? You go out there and you give all your money away to charity, and then what happens when your door is unlocked at night? Well, nobody's going to bother to come in, because even though they all know it's unlocked, they're not going to bother you, because they hope that you're not going to bother them. What's going to happen when you've given all your money away through philanthropic purposes, because you're donating it to education or cancer funding or stem cell research or whatever it is you're donating it to? I just read, I don't know, it wasn't Warren Buffett, it was somebody else, it was another billionaire. I think it was the guy behind I can't remember this. He was the paragon of philanthropy, right? The guy gave away billions and billions of his own money, okay? And he left himself with, I think, $2 million for retirement. I wouldn't be so selfless. I don't think I'd have the fortitude and self-restraint and the altruistic inclination to actually pursue that so far as he did. So I got to get hats off to him. Maybe he's a Confucian. I don't know, or maybe he's just confused. Right? A confused Confucian. He's certainly a humanist. He certainly believes in altruism, or certainly implements altruism on a personal level. But what's wrong with this? What's wrong with this assumption? Well, again, it's only as good as you expect it to be. And if, in fact, you are wrong in those expectations, if humanity isn't as altruistic and genial as you would have hoped it would be, then you are exposing yourself to all manner of liability, because you gave all your money away, and guess what? Society doesn't care. There is no social network, right? There is no social support network. People aren't going to take care of you. Okay, they say it takes a village to raise a child. Well, what does it take when you have an old, decrepit person who's too feeble to take care of themselves, and they're giving all their money away to charity? And what happens if that community is not a bunch of humanists, but is rather a bunch of, I don't know, modern day contemporary materialistic Americans, and they don't give a shit about you because they presuppose that you never gave a shit about them, and so that's just the way it works? Well, what happens in that case? Well, Confucianism, right, breaks down at that point. Again, so it only works in certain contexts when you genuinely have people who are truly altruistic and decent and noble in their spirit. Confucius did not want to deal with the metaphysical. Okay, many of these ancient philosophers and many of these ancient philosophical precepts presuppose something about the afterlife. They presuppose that there's this ethereal realm. They presuppose the idea that we have metaphysical dualism, the idea that there's something that is separable about the consciousness from the body. Right? Confucius said, we don't understand any of that. We don't know it well enough to understand it completely enough so as to be able to categorically make a ruling as to whether or not that's true. And because he was being intellectually honest with himself, whereas a lot of these competing philosophers really weren't, because they really didn't know enough about this. They didn't have PET scans, they didn't have MRIs, they didn't know anything about consciousness at that time. Other philosophers just went ahead and said, well, there's this idea of a soul or a spirit, or a ghost, or whatever you want to call it, right? That inhabits the body. And that entity, that metaphysical entity, is fundamentally distinct and can be differentiated from the body, right? Confucius said, no, we are bodies. That is all there is to it. We are bodies, right? We don't have bodies. We are bodies, right? So he did not embrace dualism. He believed that you are what you see. I mean, yes, your consciousness may be centered somewhere behind your eyes and your brain somewhere, but that's all it is, right? And when you die, you're gone and done, and the dust falls over you, and that's the end of it. So there was no real metaphysical or ethereal component to this, right? And I think that in some ways you could say, therefore, that Confucius was a materialist, a philosophical materialist, not a materialist in the Marxist sense. And so Confucianism itself really emphasized, besides being the sort of the proto-humanistic philosophy that all other iterations of humanism sort of co-opt and embrace and try to improve upon or elucidate even further, Confucianism explicitly stated that life is all about being courteous and honoring your obligations, honoring the parent, honoring the obligations that he or she has to his or her children, the children honoring their obligations to their parents, filial piety, obedience to the father and the mother, respecting and revering thy father, right? Honor thy father and thy mother, okay? And not only in the context of the family, but also in the context of the state. And so the people, the constituent citizens within the state, the ancient Chinese state, it was incumbent upon them to defer to obey, to respect, and to revere their ruler, their king. However, that's a two-way street, and so therefore it becomes incumbent upon the king or the ruler, whoever that happens to be, the highest, the guy at the top of the feudal echelon. It's incumbent upon that person to ensure that he treats his subjects with decency and compassion and justice, and in a manner that doesn't offend against the sensibilities of a truly equitable person. Now, talking about things that are evocative of other concepts that we've already discussed, I think this is one that should seem to resonate with you as being very nostalgic of something we just talked about a little while ago. Maybe not in the context of the last hour's conversation, but something that I talked about on Wednesday, certainly. This idea of reciprocity between subject and lord. Where does this otherwise play out at? Well, it plays out in the mandate of heaven. That's where it plays out at, right? This idea that the Lord only has obligations that it is incumbent upon him to honor if in fact he's ruling in a way that is decent and consistent with the best and highest interests of his people, his citizens. And as soon as he begins to abuse them and treat them in a way that suggests that he's this invidious, megalomaniacal, dictatorial autocrat, well, then he's dispossessed of his legitimacy, his right to actually rule, because the gods have rescinded the sanctification that they would otherwise offer to legitimate his rule. And so he's lacking in moral veracity at that point. So I think that's another corollary, right? So what I'm looking at here is I want you guys to try to tie these threads, these interrelated threads together, right? And some of these are more inextricably associated than others, right? The idea that the the principles of humanism, this notion of going out there and this reciprocal dynamic between people, this reciprocal interchange, is analogous to karma. All right, that I think is a very salient point, and hopefully one that you can grasp very easily. Maybe the connection between Confucianism and the mandate of heaven is less conspicuous, but I see it still being there. Right, I see there being echoes of this principle in the context of what Confucius is actually saying, in the sense that you owe people certain duties, certain obligations, but they're reciprocal in the sense that if you show loyalty and you demonstrate commitment and you live in accordance with the laws as a citizen, then therefore it's incumbent upon the ruler of that state to ensure that he protects you and he doesn't disabuse himself of the notion that the law is supreme. Application to government and rulers. So what I'm gonna talk about eventually, probably not tonight because I see I'm already crossing the hour threshold and I still gotta get to the study guide and I have no idea how long that's gonna take. And I think there's about 16 questions on here and there's 17 questions on here. So if I take 4 or 5 minutes with each of those questions, that's going to be like over 100 minutes, and I don't have over 100 minutes. So I'm gonna have to close escrow on the slides here real soon. But if you extrapolate Confucian principles beyond just mediating how you interface with other people in general, if you say, well, let's govern the state according to the principles of Confucius, what does that get you? What does that result in? Well, if you presuppose that people are good, noble, and altruistic, and honest, and decent, and honorable, and all those good things, well, then what kind of international diplomacy are you going to engage in? What does your foreign policy look like? Well, it's going to look like you're going to be like, I would say, I don't know, modern day Canada, I suppose, right? I hate to pick on Canadians, and hopefully there's nobody listening here that's actually from Canada or thinks too highly of Canada, besides the fact that they breed the world's greatest hockey players. No, I can't say that, right? Because that's Russia and Calumet that are actually in competition with them. I think that's the order of precedence. No, it's Calumet first. I don't know why Detroit is hockey town. I really don't. I think I made this point before, but I'll make it again because this is going on YouTube. Calumet should be hockey town. It really should be. Historically, culturally, just look at the numbers. Look at the statistics. Look at how many champions we produced. Many. Per capita. Per capita. That's the point, right? But I think if you look at Canada, and you see that Canadians in general are pretty altruistic people. I don't want to say that they're naive, but I think they're fairly idealistic, and they tend to assume the worst about they tend to assume the best about people, right? And that's fine. That's good. It makes them very congenial individuals, right? And that's my experience, right? Now, I think I may have mentioned this to you guys, or maybe I mentioned this to the political science group. I can't remember which class I actually mentioned this to, but I traveled extensively to Canada. I got a condo up there at Blue Mountain. It's a great ski resort, beautiful skiing, some of the best skiing on the side of the Continental Divide. And I spent years going up. Well, I didn't spend years in Canada, but I spent many years traveling up and down there intermittently. And in the course of my interactions with Canadians, I can tell you that they're much nicer in Canada than they are here in the United States. The United States, people here tend to be cynical, tend to be disrespectful, tend to be very selfless, tend to be very materialistic, tend to be the antithesis of all the sorts of things that Confucius would presuppose that people actually are. So going back to how you rule a state, I would think that you would assume that other states are going to act in good faith, are always going to be honest and forthcoming with you with respects to being transparent in diplomatic relations, are always going to tell you what they're actually planning on doing, are never going to try to bamboozle or deceive you or be disingenuous in any way, right? Are never actually planning and scheming and plotting behind your back. Now, what does this sound like? For those of you who are steeped in the philosophy of realpolitik, you'll know that this is Confucianism has no place in the School of International Relations. If you went to Georgetown, okay, Georgetown is a Catholic university. I have very great respect for Georgetown, not because it's necessarily run by the Jesuits. I mean, they know how to teach people, but it has one of the premier programs in diplomacy in foreign relations. In fact, most of the people who go to work for the U.S. State Department, I think this is statistically still true. Many of our foreign service officers, I think most of our foreign service officers actually were graduates or undergraduates in one of the foreign service programs that Georgetown runs. Now, if you go to the Georgetown Foreign Service Program and you start taking, international relations 101, foreign relations 101, what the textbook that they are going to use, I can tell you right now. I mean, I've never taken these classes, but I can tell you just intuitively that and categorically also that one of the textbooks that they're going to use is going to be The Prince by Machiavelli, Niccolò Machiavelli, who was a 16th century Florentine philosopher. And he was the progenitor, the incipient thinker of the concept, which has come down to us and which is now known as realpolitik, which is a phrase that I think was ascribed to Bismarck, or was attributable to Bismarck. He was the one who called it that, right? Realpolitik is the opposite of Confucianism when it comes to how to actually go about regulating your international affairs. Realpolitik is guided by Machiavellian assumptions, and Machiavelli says, be shrewd, be clever, outwit, outsmart your opponent, and always be plotting, always be scheming, always be thinking 3 or 4 moves ahead, because life is a game of chess, and politics is especially a game of chess. And if you don't know that, just look at how successful Vladimir Putin has been at outwitting and outplaying the rest of the competition on the global board of chess, and he's a grand chess master when it comes to geopolitical relations. Compare him to George W. Bush, for instance, right? Who was an amateur at chess, right? Who barely even knew the function of a pawn. But I guess that's a digression. The point here, though, is that if you presuppose that whoever it is on the other side of the negotiating table, whether it's friend or foe or somebody in between those positions, if you presuppose all that Confucius would presuppose about that person, you're going to end up being taken advantage of. You're going to end up deceiving yourself into thinking that people are actually much better than they really truly are, and you're going to be taken advantage of, and people are going to exploit you, and people are going to be able to attack you, and you're not going to expect it, because you wouldn't assume that they're going to attack you if you assume that all people are noble and guided by altruistic principles and all the other sorts of things that Confucius actually assumed. So it's nice to think that, but I think it's wishful thinking, and wishful thinking is dangerous because it leads us into a manner of self-deception, and self-deception is the worst kind of deception, because you are the perpetrator as well as the victim, right? You perpetrate the deception, but it has the effect of misleading you, leading you astray, and so you've only deceived yourself, and it's a very bad thing. I mean, I know that sounds a bit silly, but that is in fact, I believe, the case. All right, I don't think I'm going to have time for any more of this slideshow business, so we'll come back to, I'm leaving off on slideshow number 12. We'll start. I don't know when I'm going to have time to make the next recording, guys. This is like I said, this is functionally, this is Monday's class, right? So long as I get something out there on YouTube before Wednesday, I think you guys should be happier. You shouldn't feel as though you should be complaining about that. In fact, technically speaking, we don't even have class on Wednesday. In fact, I might not even make a video for Wednesday. I'll just make a video for, I don't know, Friday or something, right? Whatever. Because technically, why don't we have class on Wednesday? Because your test is on Wednesday, okay? Now, I don't really actually expect that you're going to be dedicating Wednesday morning from 9 until, 10:53, let's call it, right? To actually sitting down and writing, typing,
the answer responses to the questions that I ask on the test. I don't think you're going to be doing that. I mean, I think you'll probably be doing that in the evening or in the afternoon or whenever you have time. Hopefully, you set some significant period of time apart so you can actually do that. But let's just presuppose, for the sake of argument, that Wednesday is our test day. And if, in fact, that's what we assume, then I am off the hook for producing a lecture video, and you are off the hook for actually having to listen to one. So I say we're all the better off for it. And honestly, that's the way it was going to work out anyways, because we would just had Wednesday would have been a dedicated test day. I wouldn't have been lecturing, right? So this week was supposed to be an easy week for you guys. I mean, easy in the sense that you have you have to take a test, but notwithstanding that, easy otherwise in the sense that you only had to listen to about an hour's worth of substantive lecture material for the course, and then the remainder of the first class session on Monday was going to be relegated to talking about study guide, which high time at last we've come to. Okay, so I'm done with the PowerPoint slide. We'll come back to this next time, like I said, whenever that's going to be, I don't know. And it's coming up on 8 o'clock, which means I probably have about 20 minutes to. I'm going to take more time. Okay. Now, I'm going to preface everything that I say by adding some qualifications to how I'm going to go through this. Right. So my first caveat is this, and maybe I said this before, but I'll say it again. If all you do is use what I'm going to say in conjunction with this study guide review session as the sole and exclusive basis of how you're going to formulate your answers in response to the test questions whenever you get around to actually answering them. If that's all you do, if all you do is rely upon what my representations in the context of this particular segment of the video, if that's all you do, expect to get a C or even a D on the test. Because I'm not going to give you A-level responses, right? The whole idea that this is a review session, okay? So the function of a review session is to recapitulate the more salient points that are associated with these particular topics, not, conversely, to go through in a minutia of excruciatingly small detail and expound upon every minuscule detail that could conceivably fall under the rubric of a particular question. I'm not going to do that, right? Nor should I have to. I've already gone out of my way by giving you a study guide, which I don't have to do that. I don't have to do that. I'm doing it because I'm nice and I'm generous and because I'm consistent, because I've always done this, so I got to do it for you because I did it for other groups. I don't have to sit down and talk about this at all. I could just say, all right, I'm done. I'm going to log into Steam right now, and I'll see you guys on Friday or whenever I put a next video up. I'm not going to do that either. I'm going to talk about this. I'm going to talk about it a little, and I may end up talking about it a lot because this is exactly the speech that I gave for my political science students. And I said, I'm not going to give you guys A answers for the study guide review session, but then I ended up giving 80% of the answers were actually A quality answers. So who knows? We'll see. But I'm coming up on an hour and 12 minutes now in this video, and I don't want to take up any more of your time or my time. And so let's just go ahead and commence with the study guide. So if you don't have the study guide, do yourself a favor, print it off, come back here with it, okay? Or have it on your computer in front of you so you can make notations with your Word document or whatever word processor you have, whatever program you have, a rich text editor document, or ideally have it in front of you physically, okay, so you can actually make notations and do write down some of the points that I'm saying, obviously, but reconcile the stuff with the notes. That's how you're supposed to go through and negotiate the rigors and the travails and the tribulations of the test, not just and don't just throw back at me verbatim what I say. Don't do that, okay? I don't want to hear you ventriloquizing my own words back to me, okay? Don't just say exactly what I'm going to say, again, verbatim, what I say, all right? Conceptualize these things in a way that enables you to speak about them in your own words. And I don't care how eloquently or how crudely those words may actually congeal. I don't care what form they take. But all I care about is whether or not you can establish to my satisfaction that you know what the hell you're actually talking about. Choose your words. I'm not even going to say choose your words carefully. I don't even care if you spelling. Now actually spelling does become a concern because now you can use spell check, and I would think less of you if you didn't. So do use spell check and do use grammar check. All right, I'm going to just shut up and get through this because otherwise I'm going to go on all night. Number one, primary and secondary sources. What are the differences? I want you to explain what they are. Okay, remember, the way in which we differentiate between a primary source and a secondary source is when they happen in time, chronologically. Okay, so a primary source is something that happened contemporaneous with the person or the place or the thing or the place, the event that you're studying in time. Okay, that's a primary source. It happens at that time, sequentially, contemporaneous with, simultaneous with the event in time. Therefore,
A secondary source is a thing, is a source, a resource for us to study, for us to analyze, for us to utilize, that is created after the fact, right? It's created after the historical person or the historical thing or the historical place or the empire or whatever, the civilization that you're studying, right? That is the primary way in which we delineate and differentiate between primary and secondary sources. Give me examples, okay? It's not enough just say that and leave it at that, right? Examples. Now, I gave you some pretty good examples in class, and I think that's probably enough. But I'll give you some examples again. Primary source examples, right? So, a diary, right? You're a soldier on the front lines of the Battle of Waterloo or Leipzig, okay, and you're fighting against Napoleon, and you're a Prussian, and you're recording the battle, the actual battle, and how it plays out, and the artillery and the cavalry and whatever else is happening, right? And you're writing in your journal, and the year is 1810, right? That's a primary source, okay. That source is actually contemporaneous with the event that you're assuming you're studying the campaigns, the military exploits of Napoleon. That would be a primary source. Now, if you're studying the demographics of the city of Paris in 1810, that wouldn't be a primary source. So it has to be a source that is materially related to the topic that you're studying, not just, oh, it happened at the same time, right? I mean, there's a lot of primary Roman sources out there that in no way have bearing on the particular aspect of Roman history that you could conceivably be studying, right? I'm not going to study Roman poetry to discern the nuance of Roman law, jurisprudence, right? The vases, the vases, the artifacts of Rome are not going to give me much insight. The pottery of Rome is not going to give me much insight into the jurisprudence of Rome. Okay, so it has to be materially pertinent to the thing that you're studying, in addition to happening at the same time as that event. Another example of primary source would be an autobiography, right? I go out there and I write my own biography, okay? Well, I am a witness to my own life, and I'm writing about that life, and therefore I'm relevant, right? I'm a material witness, and I exist at the same time as the thing that I'm writing about, my life, okay? What is another primary source? Oh, I mean, there's so many of them, guys. I mean, I'm not going to go through this with you. Just refer back to your notes, okay? Secondary sources, examples of secondary sources. How about this? Your textbook. Is your textbook a secondary source? Shit, that reminds me. I was supposed to talk about the textbook. We don't have time for it. I was going to read some questions out of the textbook and answer them for you, but we'll do that next time. The textbook is a secondary source, right? The textbook is not a primary source because the textbook was published, the year of the publication was, I think, 2015 is the copyright date on that. We're studying history that transpired over 2,000 years ago, so obviously that's not a primary source, right? It is ipso facto, by definition, a secondary source. If I keep taking this much time, because I think that was 5 minutes on one question, we're never going to get through this. What substantive areas of history are there? I'll tell you what, guys. One of the things that I'm going to be doing here is I'm going to be interacting with this document for your benefit while I'm going through it, because there are certain questions on here that I just don't like for various reasons. I don't like that particular question. I think that's a stupid question. In fact, I don't even know why I asked that, because every year when I teach this class, every fall when I get around to teaching this class, I ask that question, I incorporate it in my study guides, and I end up doing the same thing, which is what I'm going to do right now. Well, I'm going to cross that out because I think that is a trivially easy question. The question answers itself. Okay, I mean, it literally answers itself, but I meant metaphorically as well. All right, so question number 2 is not in any way going to show up on your test. Not that this matters, right? Because this stuff's not going to come as a surprise. I mean, this would be a more salient concern if, in fact, you were taking this test the traditional, old-fashioned, or conventional way, which would be to say that you're going to sit down there and, I slap the test down on your desk and, well, bam, it's right there, and that's the first time you're seeing it, right? You guys are going to have plenty of time to contemplate and cogitate your answers, so I don't think it really matters whether or not you have advanced notice, number 2 is not going to be on the test, right? Big deal. You're going to find out, you're going to have plenty of time to think about it. So, but anyways, just to save you the time and the trouble, you don't have to bother wasting time preparing for that. Number 3, distinguish between a topical or thematic approach versus a chronological. I don't like the way that's worded. Well, let me actually read that and try to, instead of not reading that question, try to just blurt it out here. Distinguish between topical or thematic approach to understanding history and chronological. I don't like the way that's worded, but that could conceivably show up on the test. If it showed up on the test, I'd probably word it in a way that's more intuitive to understanding what it's actually talking about. Right, so what I want you to do is explain what a chronological approach to organizing a study of the past is. Right, chronology is a line moving forward in time, a sequential line moving forward in time, upon the trajectory of which you have events A, B, C, D, E, right, so on and so forth, right? So you have the first thing happens at this particular time, and you have the second thing, and then subsequent events happen thereafter, right? And so you're organizing, you're structuring your approach to studying the past and interpreting the events that happen in the past based on when they happen in relation to one another. Okay, that's chronological. Chronograph, watch, right? Things like that. Versus topical or thematic, that's using a Venn diagram, okay, where you have these circles that represent certain ideas, right, or certain concepts that are thematically dissociated from each other, or maybe in fact associated with each other, right? So the examples that I gave, right, to just elucidate this point a little bit further, is to say political history and military history and economic history and women's history and the history of minorities in this country, right? All those things fall under the general analytical rubric of, I would say, social history, which is also inclusive of cultural history. I think culture is a subordinate constituent element within, under the auspices of social history. Now, it depends a lot on how you define these terms. This is a slightly subjective exercise. It comes down to semantics, but I think social history is very inclusive, right? So the way you would organize your study, if and my light's just dimmed. I don't know if UPCO is working in this area. I actually saw one of their trucks driving around. I really hope I don't lose power tonight, because that means I'm gonna have to restart this whole recording. Well, actually, no, it doesn't mean. I don't know what it means. Hopefully this will save on its own, but hopefully it doesn't get cut off, because I'm gonna be really pissed off if it does. But all the more reason to finish this up quickly. Okay, so I'm not going to give you the full answers, right? I promised I wouldn't, and I'm going to try very hard not to. So that's something to get you started on. That should give you enough to point you in the right direction with respect to number 3. Number 4, talk about this 5-step methodological process, right? I'll give you a hint. This is a big hint. Actually, this is not so much a hint about the substance of the question. It's just a hint about its significance. Put a star next to number 4, because if that shows up on the test, it's gonna be a very substantial point question. Okay. The other thing I should have said when I prefaced all this with my introductory remarks was to say that when you look at the test, make sure one of the things that you do is you assign your time and the degree of effort that you associate with a particular response as a function of how many points happen to be assigned to that particular question. So all questions are not created equally. Okay, number 4 is a question that is much more rigorous analytically than numbers 1 through 3. Okay, the response that is necessary to get a satisfactory grade on to earn all the points associated with number 4 is going to be a much more extensive and elaborate response, as opposed to the response that you would be required to give me for number 1, for instance, and satisfy the requirements of that particular question. Number 1, if it showed up on your test, is going to be like a 10-point question, right? If number 4 showed up on the test, it might be a 25-point question, even a 30-point question, right? And the more points there are associated with the question, the harder you better work, right? And the more I better see you write, right? So elaborate, okay? Really elaborate very comprehensively, right? I'm looking for expansiveness in terms of the breadth of your knowledge, but I'm also looking for extensiveness in terms of the depth of your knowledge, right? So you better know a lot about the stuff that really matters the most. That's the whole point. So this question concerns itself all about with methodology. So remember, you start this analysis off with asking yourself the question, why did such and such thing happen in the way that it did, right? I gave you guys the illustration in class of I think the example that I gave, and I'm pretty sure I remember this. Why did Nazi Germany invade the Soviet Union? Okay, but again, that's a hypothetical question. It doesn't have to be that. In fact, I don't want you to use that, right? Why did something happen in the way that it did, right? Fill in, X, Y, Z. I don't care what you guys say, right? Why did Calumet become the boom city that it did back in the turn of the 19th century? It's a complicated question, right? But it's a question that you have to ask a certain question, hypothetical question. You have to actually even ask you have to fill in the blanks. Just let me know that you're starting off with asking the question and what the question is actually directed at doing, right? So what you do is you ask the question, and then what do? You go out there and you find sources. Okay, you identify sources that materially relate to the elements that are going to be associated with your inquiry. But that's not all you do, right? And actually, I may be confusing the steps, because it's been a while since I've had to answer this question myself. But one of the other things that you do, right? And honestly, guys, I'm going to give you guys a break on this, right? Because I'm probably doing a bad job of the sequence of this myself. I don't care what order you do this in, right? Just as long as number 1, you start off with asking the question, right? And then number 2, 3, and 4, I don't really care about. And then the last thing, it's important that you have that last in your order sequentially, right? Which is answering the question, using the analysis, the preceding analysis to answer that question, right? So number 2, let's say, is go out there and find sources, right? But I refer you to the slide. The slide on this actually does a very good job of explaining what the process entails. I don't have it in front of me, and that's why I'm doing kind of a botched job at it. So let's say one of the things that you have to do is go out there and find sources, right? Identify sources that relate materially to the question, okay? Set parameters, okay? Remember to set parameters. What does it mean to set parameters for your study? Make sure that your study is not overly broad. Make sure it's not too comprehensive, right? And make sure the parameters relate materially to the question that you're actually asking, right? So if you're asking about Calumet, the place that you want to study would be the Keweenaw, right? The time that you would want to study would probably be the late 19th century, early 20th century, something like that, right? If you're studying the history of the early mining community up here. So again, the parameters are strictures. They constrain the scope and the expansiveness of your study so that you're not meandering all over the place infinitely. And they direct you along a certain trajectory that hopefully brings you to the information that you actually find to be valuable and enables you to discern the answer to your question. What else do you need to do? Well, there's some other things that you have to do, and I can't think of them right now off the top of my head, so I'm not actually going to tell you what they are, but I can go back to the slides and I can go back to my notes, and so too can you, right? So I'm going to just leave it at that. And honestly, I think if I spent 10 more seconds on this, I probably could think of the things, but I don't want to tell you 100% of the answers, right? I'm going to tell you maybe 50% of the answers, right? So I'm not going to give you all that you need. And I already told you my methodology. I told you the reason I'm doing this. So you guys should know this. But I'm still helping you out nonetheless. Number 5, differentiate between the two types of early social constructs, hunter-gatherers versus agrarian peoples. Identify which of these two was more conducive to the development of civilization and the reasons as to why that was the case. If this shows up on the test, it's another star question. It's another big point. Large point value question. Okay, this is a big point value question. And the reason for that is because when I talked about this was, I think, the very first lecture that I gave before we actually met in person. So go back to the first YouTube video that I uploaded, right? It was a good one. I was playing around with the plaster dog in my dad's office back home in Detroit. I was doing a lot of other stupid things. And in the course of that discussion, in the course of that monologue, I really did expound upon the nature of hunter-gatherers and the nature of agrarians, agrarian-type people, not agrarians. They were agrarian in their nature. But so some of the things that I want you to talk about, just these are the generalities, right? These are not the specific things, but just in general principle. I want you to tell me the differences between these two groups. What made the agrarian type people so successful at sustaining and supporting large populations? What was so precarious and dangerous and haphazardous about living in a hunter-gatherer type construct? What made it so precarious? What did you have to do? You had to go run around in the jungle or the Serengeti plains of Africa or wherever it was you were running around it, wearing nothing but loincloth and having nothing but a spear or a club or a rudimentary weapon of some sort, and you had to go out there and you had to find animals to hunt. Okay, that was laborious. It was exhausting. It took a lot of work. It took a lot of energy. What happens when you expand a lot of energy? Well, you need to be burning calories, right? What do you need to do when you burn calories? You need to replenish those calories. What does that require? It requires a lot of food, right? And so you're expending more calories than you can support yourself with in terms of the food that you procure. So you're living in a condition whereby you're barely able to make it work. You're barely able to establish a subsistence level type existence, right? And barely have enough food to sustain yourself, right? And support yourself. And so you're not prepared for the unforeseeable. You're not prepared for things that come up, such like plague and pestilence and bad weather and other things that interrupt the continuity of your hunting and gathering. And that causes significant disruptions in your food supply, which may conceivably lead to your extinction, the extinction of the rest of the people that are hunting and gathering with you. Now, what else can we say about hunter-gatherers? I mean, that's one thing, okay? There's a lot of things, right? Remember, the availability of food itself depends on the weather and the climate and what's going on environmentally, right? And the ecology of the area that you happen to be living in, right? So this is very precarious. It's very precipitous, right? Or precipitous in the sense that it can change very, very rapidly, right? And it's much more, hunter-gatherers are much more egalitarian, okay? Meaning that you need to rely upon the people, all people, more equitably. You need to rely upon them because everybody has a part to play in a hunter-gatherer construct, because you can't afford not to co-opt everybody in the tribe. And that's what it is. It's a tribal form of existence, right? And so women and children are considered to be maybe not co-equals with men, but they're given deference, right? They're given deference and they're assigned importance because they perform important roles. They have a function in relation to the overall functionality and viability of society as a whole, right? And if you have social utility, if you provide some utilitarian function in relation to the tribe as a whole, then chances are you're going to be treated and regarded with some deference and some consideration. Think about Native Americans. Native Americans are hunter gatherers, right? They're a more evolved sort of form of hunter gatherers. They're much more efficient and proficient than the originals, but they tend to treat their women in a fairly equitable manner. I mean, it's a patriarchal society, of course, right? Hierarchical. It's really a gerontocracy. It's a rule of the old. But they have regard for their women because the women do a lot of things with the buffalo, right? They prepare the skins. They do a lot of things, right? I mean, they cook. You can tell I'm not an anthropologist when it comes to Native American culture, but the point is that you need to co-opt the women to be successful because if you don't, there are too few people doing too little, and you won't have enough to actually sustain and support for sustain yourselves and supply yourselves and enable your existence to continue in any viable way. Agrarian culture, right? There's a lot you can say about agrarian societies or agrarian social constructs. One of the things that I said is that agrarian societies slash social constructs allow for people to become divergent in terms of what they actually do because they specialize in certain things. You can become a blacksmith, you can become a warrior, you can become an alchemist, you can become a priest, right? You can become, I don't know what you want to become, right? But you don't all have to be farmers, right? Because it's just a certain subset of the population has to be farmers in order to ensure that you have enough agricultural production to supply you with that which you actually require to subsist off of. So there's less people doing less work. Why is that the case? Because when you're thinking about farming versus going out there and chasing after, I don't know, some wildebeest, right, or whatever it is you're chasing after, the woolly mammoth or something, right? Farming is much less energetic. It's far less laborious. It's less tedious. It's less time consuming. It doesn't burn as many calories, and anybody can do it. Okay. Whereas hunting and gathering requires precision, skill, strength, agility, and a lot of time and a lot of patience and a lot of effort, and there's a lot of danger involved as well. So those are. I'm going to stop, right, because I just gave you most of the answer right there. Right. That's like 85% of the answer right there. But the point I'm trying to make here, and this is a good demonstration of this, is that if you really think about this, okay, anyone, and this is true of most, not all of these questions, but the star questions at least, right? If you really think about that particular question, whatever it happens to be, there's actually a lot to say about it, right? You can approach it superficially, and you can just give me a bullshit answer, right? Or you could approach it more comprehensively, and you can just go on and on and on, like I'm doing right now, and I can continue to go on and on and on, but I'm coming up to an hour and a half, and I don't have time for it. Distinguish between the following terms as per our discussion in lecture. Again, this harkens back to one of those YouTube video lectures. I can't remember which one. I think it was the same one that I was talking about the hunter-gatherers in. Society, culture, and civilization. So society is just a group of people living together working towards a common purpose. Okay, that's all society was, right? I mean, because I said a frat house would be a society, right? If you and your homies or you and your girls get together in a minivan and you go out for a night on the town to the bar, right? You're a society of sorts, right? You're a group, you have a common purpose, you're trying to achieve a common goal. You're doing it collectively, collaboratively, right? I mean, those are the fundamentals of society, right? So society is pretty generic, right? It's pretty inclusive. It's very comprehensive, right? So it's a group of people working together collaboratively towards a common purpose, right? A common purpose that is ostensibly advantageous or in the interest of those people who are constituent members of that group. That's a society. Culture are the unique things that enable a particular society to differentiate itself from other societies. So language, arts, music, a written or oral tradition, the stories and the legends and all the sorts of things that make up the mythology of a particular people, right? The history of the people, right? All those things that differentiate a particular people from others, right? Whatever they may be, okay. However, and these things are highly divergent. They're highly eccentric because there's many different cultures out there that are very erratically different from other cultures. Civilization, okay. Civilization is sort of the apotheosis of the cultural advancement, right? And I actually gave a fairly explicit definition of civilization, and I don't want to make that any more convoluted than it has to be. So I don't want to say anything that repudiates or is contrary to that definition and therefore confuse you right now, because I don't have that definition in front of me right now. So I would just refer you to the slides that discuss that and the lecture, especially, that discusses that, right? So in terms of order of precedence, what you defer to first is what I say in the lecture. Okay, that takes preeminence over everything else, right? That supersedes everything else. Use that, and if you use that, you will not go wrong when you answer these questions. After that, if you can't find something in the lecture, then default to the PowerPoint slides, right? And hopefully they'll clarify that which was not covered in the lecture. But I guarantee, I can guarantee categorically, everything on the study guide, right, is going to be contained somewhere in the lectures, right? Some either stuff that I said in the class or stuff that I said in the course of the videos, right? It's going to be somewhere there for you to find. Whether or not you were there that day or you're paying attention, well, that's on you. All right. And lastly, if you can't find it in the lectures or in the materials associated with the PowerPoint slides, then there's only one place left to look, and that's the book. But there's a reason why it's the last place, is because it's probably the least likely place that you're going to find it. And those of you who don't have the book, don't worry about it, because you'd probably be wasting your time looking in there anyway. So you're not going to find any answers in the book, or any good answers in the book. And don't do what some foolish people have done in the past. Don't go to do Wikipedia and think that you can cheat your way into a good grade on this test because you have no idea what you'd otherwise be talking about. No, you better use my thoughts on this, right? Not my language, right? But the way in which we approach this, the way in which we conceptualize this in this class. And that is divergent from the way in which Wikipedia or any other, Britannica or whoever else you go to. I'm going to know that you were using some source that is materially different than the stuff that we talked about in this class. I'm going to know, because I know what I say and I know how I say it. Right? So don't do that, right? You're going to be feeling the hurt when the grades come back if you do that, right? So just that's words to the wise from the wise, he who knows. Number 7, what practical advantages did the development of a rudimentary system of writing confer upon the civilization which employed it? This goes back to 2 different lectures, one of which was one of the first YouTube videos that I produced, and then the other one was a few weeks ago. But regardless, what we talked about is it confers a certain measure of stability, certitude, and certainty to things that otherwise would be ambiguous. So I talked about contracts, for instance, right? If you have a verbal contract, here's a trick question for those of you who are aspiring law students and lawyers: is a oral contract generally considered to be enforceable? If I have a oral contract, you agreed to go over here and mow my lawn for $75 a month, and we stipulated those terms. We both agreed to them. We made an oral compact between the two of us. Is that enforceable in court if one of us reneges on that? If one of us ostensibly violates the terms of that contract, fails to perform, or fails to do whatever was expected of them? No. Generally speaking, it is almost categorically not enforceable. So what writing enables you to do is establish precisely what the terms of the contract were, precisely what was expected reciprocally from one party in relation to another. Right? That's helpful. It also enables you to have a much more efficient government bureaucracy. Right, because now you're able to convey orders from the supreme commander of the state, whether he's a king, whether he's a bishop, whether he's a, I don't know, an emperor, whatever he happens to be, whatever form he takes. He's able to convey those orders in a very explicit manner, and they don't get lost in translation, which is what happens in an oral culture when you have a tradition, when you have an oral tradition. And oral traditions aren't all that bad, because Homer, the Homeric epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, and the stories, the adventures of King Odysseus of Ithaca, that was all a product of an oral tradition, right? He was a blind, illiterate bard. Although he was actually, technically speaking, he was living in a literate civilization, but he himself was illiterate. So I guess it's sort of a 6 one way, half dozen the other. But I think oral traditions are also important too. So this is not to denigrate the significance of oral traditions or oral cultures, but it is to say that written language has an advantage over them. Okay. Now, let's talk about, so that there's more to say about that, all right? I'm just giving you some insights. I think that was most of what you could say about that. I think you could probably, dress it up a little bit, elaborate a little bit more. Number 8, describe the ascendancy of Sargon to the rulership of the Akkadian Empire. Remember, he was like Jimmy Hoffa to the gardeners and the groundskeepers, right? So those of you who don't know who Jimmy Hoffa is, you got to go and learn about the American labor movement, okay? You've obviously never been a member of the union, at least not the AFL-CIO or the Teamsters, or indeed the UAW, I would say, because if you're a member of any of those guys, the Brotherhood of Labor, the fraternity of working men and women now, you would know that the name Jimmy Hoffa is one that you whisper with great adulation and awe and reverence, because he was one of the founding fathers of the Teamsters Brotherhood. Why do I say he's analogous to Sargon, who was one of the founding members of the Akkadian dynasty? Well, because Sargon, much like Jimmy Hoffa, was a organizer of the workers, an organizer of the laborers. He was kind of like Hoffa in the sense that Hoffa went out to the factories and the truck stops and the back docks where the guys driving the forklifts were working and everything. And he recruited men to join him and to create a brotherhood, a solidarity amongst the working men, so that they would have the power of collective bargaining. Now, Sargon didn't do that because he wanted to, bend General Motors over the barrel, or negotiate with Henry Ford or something and get concessions for a better contract for the UAW. No, Sargon went around and he recruited gardeners, right? Remember that? He recruited gardeners, right? Fellow gardeners, the groundskeepers, right? Remember I was talking about him? He was like groundskeeper Willie, the drunken guy from The Simpsons, the Irish guy. He's always drunk and he's mowing the lawn at the high school or whatever he's doing. That's what Sargon was like. And Sargon goes out there and he recruits gardeners, and he's able to overthrow the previous regime by virtue of inspiring his fellow working men. All right, and so that's the connection between him and the modern day Jimmy Hoffa. I like drawing parallels, and maybe it's a little bit spurious to try to make that analogy, but I think it works if you understand if you know who Jimmy Hoffa was, and if you don't, go out and watch The Irishman. It's a Scorsese movie. It was made for television. Netflix film was absolutely amazing. I know it's 3.5 hours long, but it's worth every minute of it. Okay, go out there, watch it. You learn a lot about Jimmy Hoffa, and you learn a lot about the American working man and the American labor movement, which is something you should learn about. Okay, number 9. In what ways was the promulgation of a codified law by Hammurabi preferable to a civilization which lacked a corpus of laws that were explicitly articulated? Which lacked a corpus of. Okay, so the rub here of the question is, what made the fact that Hammurabi's laws were written down, what made that different and more preferable to what came before that? Well, what came before that was a system where laws were transmitted orally, verbally. Okay, so you didn't necessarily know what the law was, right? In fact, a lot of times the law was whatever the judge said it was. Okay, and that allows for unlimited discretion on behalf of the judge. Now, it's true even in American jurisprudence, in the contemporary criminal justice system, we have what is known as discretionary sentencing, which is to say that judges have some latitude in terms of how they actually sentence an offender, but they have to conform to certain parameters, right? They can't say that, well, because you stole Mary Jane's pencil in history class at Gogobek, that therefore you're getting sent up to death row, son. Okay, there's none of that, right? But in pre-Hammurabian civilizations, there could have conceivably been, right? Because there was no constraining factor, right, in terms of what you could not do. And so to say that justice is better or is improved upon when it is codified is to make the point that laws are good when they are explicit. Okay, laws, and this is a point that I was going to make in the context of the Chinese civilization, but we didn't get around to it. But laws are better when they're effectively promulgated and disseminated to the people, so that people know what the laws actually are. Right? And the example that I gave is the last time I got a speeding ticket, which was the first time in about 10 years, which is actually pretty phenomenal considering how I drive. And actually, I better avail myself of the Fifth Amendment here, the right to protect myself against self-incrimination here. But I'll just say this, and I already said it in class, so this should be familiar to you. And the reason I'm saying this is because it's the importance of having laws that are explicitly conveyed to the people. The speed limit along US 41 is, for the most part, all the way outside of Marquette, past Munising, past Seney, and all the way down to Newberry, I think Negaunee or whatever it is. It's 65. And then you turn on to 117, which is the connector highway between US 41 and US 2, and it goes down to 55. But you don't see the sign that demarcates that distinction, that differentiation between 65 and 55. You don't see that sign until you're about 3 or 4 miles on 117, right? So you just continue to assume, well, it's 65 before, it's probably 65 here. And that's an example of the law not being very conspicuous, right? And that's a problem because you're presupposed to have knowledge of the law. Ignorance of the law is no defense in claiming that you broke the law because you didn't know what the law was. That's no defense. You can't use that. So this reduces the likelihood of arbitrary judgments. It ensures that the court, the sentencing magistrate, whoever the judge was back in the day, can only give you a certain a certain sentence, which ostensibly meets the punishment meets the crime, right? And there's a degree of certainty. An expectation that is created, right? There's an expectation that's created of the citizens themselves. As long as you refrain from doing X, Y, and Z, right, then therefore you will not be subject to these penalties, right? Now, if you do this particular thing, you can expect to have this punishment assigned to you, right? That's much better than saying, well, the law is going to be whatever old, whoever it is, Sargon, or whoever the judge happens to be that you go before, right? Whatever he says, and he may be having a bad day, and he may not like you because of the way that you look, or whatever, right? Or he may be having a nice day, and maybe he relates to you, and so this reduces the probability of prejudicial judgments, judgments that either favor you unduly, right, or are in some way prejudicial to you. They have a detrimental effect on you, right? So that's important. Number 10. What can we deduce about the nature of Hammurabi's Babylon based on the more salient features of the code which bears his name? Consider the emphasis on trade as adumbrated in the section concerning indemnification of mercantile goods on the highways, and emphasis placed on controlling women and severely punishing any type of infidelity, and how might that relate to social order? I spent a lot of time on this, guys. I expect you to know it. I don't expect to have to say anything about it. And I'm coming up to an hour and 45 minutes, so I don't really have time to say anything about it. Having said that, though, remember, the goods were indemnified by the state. Okay, if you were traveling along the ancient highways in Hammurabi's Babylon, and a group of, I don't know, Somali pirates came out of the wilderness and jacked your stuff from the back of your donkey cart with their AK-47s, and they ran off with it, you can go back to the state and say, I lost my bales of, I don't know, hay or whatever, right? And then the state would say, okay, we're going to remunerate you and compensate you for the fair market value of whatever it was that was stolen from you on the highways. What does that suggest? It suggests that commerce is very important in the context of Hammurabi's Babylon. Commerce, trade, free uninterrupted trade, uninterrupted by criminal activity on the highways, right? So obviously highway robbery was a very salient concern to the people in Hammurabi's Babylon. There was an emphasis, a special emphasis on the chastity and the purity of women, not necessarily promiscuous women, right? So if you were a low down dirty skeezer, right, you were a low down harlot, then the law didn't really favor you, right? But if you were a good, chaste woman who was dedicated to her husband and was loyal to her and pure, right, then the law would protect you, right? Because and it explicitly states in Hammurabi's code, right? For those of you who don't know the book, you wouldn't know this, but you can look it up because it probably is on Wikipedia. It explicitly states in unambiguous terms that if you are a chaste woman and a man who is not your husband takes you, okay, right, and we all know what that means, right, ravages you, right, in the more Shakespearean terms, right, ravages you, right, another man rapes you, he violates you, right, then the punishment for that man will be death, right. It doesn't say if you are a woman, and just leave it at that, right. It qualifies it, right. The qualifier is if you are a chaste woman, meaning that you are a non-promiscuous woman. Okay, so what does that suggest? It suggests that loyalty to the husband is also a preeminent concern. And therefore, disloyalty is something that was looked down upon, right? Going out there and being promiscuous and having multiple lovers and having all sorts of bastard children, that was a concern because that would interrupt with the continuity of inheritance, right? So you can get from inheritance, you can get from the law that focuses on the chastity, or the purity rather, and the chasteness of a woman. You can get from that to the concerns that Hammurabi's Babylon had with inheritance and the possibility of illegitimate children interfering with the claim that the legitimate children might have to inherit whatever the father had to actually devolve that onto the children. So those are the kind of connections that I want you guys to be able to make in response to these kinds of questions. And if you have no idea what the hell I'm talking about, then go back to the lecture notes. And if you still have no idea what the hell I'm talking about, then call me. Number 11. In what ways was Hammurabi's code antithetical to our conventional sense of justice and equality under law? Think about the disparate punishments that correlate to socioeconomic standing. All I'm saying here is, how were the punishments echeloned? And if they were echeloned, if there was a system of punishments that was differentiated, what was the differentiating factor? It was how much money you had. Remember what we said. It wasn't just that it was always an eye for an eye, or a tooth for a tooth, or a limb for a limb. It depended on who you were. Okay, and dependent on your status vis-a-vis the status of the person who you offended against, right? So if I'm a slave, if we're all slaves, right? I go out there and I poke your eye out, right? Well, then, therefore, the state is going to come back and they're going to poke my eye out in reciprocity for my having inflicted that harm into you. if I'm a master, I'm a slave master, right? A high priest in ancient Babylon, and I go out and I poke your eye out, right? Or I chop off or lob off your hand, just for shits and gigs, because I like doing that because I'm a sadistic bastard. What does Hammurabi's code say about me? Well, it says I got to compensate the owner of your owner, the slave owner, right, who happens to hold and own you as chattel. I got to compensate that person for the fair market value of your hand, and assess how much your value, your utility function as a slave has been diminished by the loss of your hand. Okay, so it's a future diminution calculus, right? And this is something that we do. Lawyers talk a lot about this, but that's the important point. The critical takeaway here is that the justice applies in a very disparate and inequitable manner, and it is predicated upon your standing in society, how much money you have. Okay, and so if I'm rich as Jeff Bezos, I'm the Jeff Bezos or the Bill Gates or the Warren Buffett of ancient Babylon, and I'm sadistic and I'm a very despotic and despicable individual. I can go around and I can cut off people's arms. I can just murder as many slaves as I want, as long as I got the cash to reimburse their owners for it. Then nobody can lay a hand on my body. Like they can't touch me, right? You can't touch this, not at all, absolutely not, right? So it depends on your wealth, it depends on your social standing, right? What class you occupy, and who it is you're offending against in relation to your own status in society, right? All those things are part of the calculus in determining what the outcome of the punishment is going to be, right? So it's not just across the board. It's not an easy calculus. It's not you did A, right, and therefore B is your punishment. No, it's well, you did A, but you are B class person and you have C amount of money, and therefore G is your punishment, right, as opposed to F is your punishment. And so it's a bit confusing, right? And it's inequitable in the sense that it treats people preferentially, not based on their, well, I guess you could say their utility in society as a whole, because the people who make more money actually are, by virtue of that the fact that they have more money, are more socially utilitarian to ancient Babylon. But it differentiates people not based on the magnitude of the offense that they committed to society as a whole, but rather based on how much cash they have. And I don't think that that's ever really a very good thing. Most of us consider that to be repugnant to our sensibilities. So that's a bad thing for us. Number 12, identify and describe some of the military strategies employed by the Assyrians, which enabled them to achieve a significant advantage over their adversaries as well as the people whom they subjugated, right? So just very, very briefly, because now I'm actually coming up to 2 hours here. Number 1, combined arms. Know what that is, know what that entails, explain it as I explained it, all right? Combined arms strategy, right? You cooperate with different, well, not cooperate, what's the right word? You employ different types of military units in conjunction with each other. And these different units have different specializations. And their specializations are based on the skill and the aptitude that they particularly have, which makes them particularly good at this particular type of thing that relates to fighting a battle. So you have guys who are really good at riding horses because they come from an equestrian society, and you recruit them for cavalry. You have guys who come from Sherwood Forest, and they learn how to shoot the bow and arrow next to Robin Hood, and he trained them very well. So you recruit them as your archer division or battalion. Right? You have guys who are very big, muscular, strong guys. They do a lot of lifting at the gym and they like to throw things. You put them in the infantry, all right, because they can throw spears at people and they can pick guys up and throw them around like the Hulk, and so on and so forth, right? And so you use your soldiers based on their specialization, and you optimize the efficacy of the military resources that you have at your disposal. And it also enables you to have a certain degree of tactical flexibility that your opponent does not, because your adversary in this particular case is going to show up at the battlefield with just 10,000 guys on horses, right? Or 1,000 guys riding around in chariots, right? And that's it. And if you got chariot guys plus spear guys, well, that enables you. It's like rock, paper, and scissors, all right? That's the way in which military tactics work, right? It's not like chess, where if you get a queen, the queen just destroys everything else out there, right? No, it's like rock, paper, scissors, right? Because rock can destroy scissors, scissors can destroy paper, but paper can take out rock, right? And so you got to make sure you have rock, paper, and scissors, because if I just bring scissors all the time to my battle, well, rock is going to be kicking my ass, right? Usually I got to figure out, I better bring rock, right? And so he who has rock, paper, and scissors, right, is he who has versatility. He who's able to evolve to a more flexible and fluid tactical dynamic. He who's able to respond more effectively to that is he who's probably going to be able to win that battle, okay? Because tactical flexibility confers a certain military advantage on the person who employs that. The other point is that this idea of the Jewish diaspora, right? Remember we talked about this. This was an illustration of what I mean. This is an example of a broader point about the Assyrians and how they dealt with people. But they did kind of what the Nazis did, right? Because they came into a territory, and what did they do? They sent the people elsewhere. They forcibly relocated them. Now tell me why they did that. I want to know why, and I'm going to leave that to you to explain that. I'm not going to tell you everything. I'm doing way too much of that already. I'm making this way too easy, and we're running out of time. Number 13. How did the geographical and topographical factors help facilitate the development of civilization in Egypt? There were three of these things. Number one, the function of the desert, a prophylactic function. It insulated the Egyptians from invasions, etc. Okay, you don't just say that, say more than that, right? This is just a very general precede to this question, right? There's more to it. Number two, where Egypt is in relation to the Mediterranean. The Mediterranean literally meant the center of the world, right? Or the central sea, because that's what the Romans and the Greeks actually thought it was. Why is that conducive to the development of commerce and trade? And what do I mean when I say that, when I quote, I think it was Cicero or Aristotle who said this, it was Aristotle who said this, that the sinews of war are infinite money. Okay, or infinite money are the sinews of war. Which is to say that you can't fight wars unless you have sufficient funds to be able to fund whatever military resources you have at your disposal, whether it's men, whether it's material, whether it's technology, whatever it is. So ultimately it comes down to a matter of how much money you have, okay? And if commerce is facilitative of military conquest is facilitative of imperialism, and that is facilitative of civilization and all the sorts of things we associate with that, well then fundamentally, incipiently, you need commerce, which goes back to the point about the Mediterranean, where you're situated in relation to other people. The third point, and I think the most nuanced point, is the one about the Nile River. What is special about the Nile River? I'll give you a hint. It's an angry, violent, vicious, tempestuous river. And what makes that conducive to the development of civilization in ancient Egypt? Well, what do you have to do? To tame that river, you got to work together, don't you? What do you have to do to build the levees, to build the irrigation systems that actually irrigate your crops, that water your crops, to enable you to support and sustain a large population? You have to do a lot. You have to work together. If it was just a calm river and it was always behaving itself, well, there wouldn't really be much need for cooperation and development of a socio-economic hierarchy and a civilization, all sorts of things that are rudimentary building blocks to a civilization. So think about the relationship of the river and what the Egyptians are doing in relation to that river, right? And why they're doing that, because of how the river is behaving itself. Why does that force the Egyptians to create the necessary building blocks of a higher form of civilization? Think about that. I just gave it all away. That may not be a star question. That's sort of an asterisk question, right? It's a not quite a star question, but it's kind of an important question. And it is a lot. There's actually more going on than you may realize. Identify and discuss the ways in which Pharaoh Akhenaten sought to change the Egyptian religious practices, and likewise expound upon why such changes may have been pragmatic and advantageous for the power of the Pharaoh vis-a-vis the other elements in Egyptian society. Akhenaten created the idea of worshiping a single god. So he transitioned from polytheism to monotheism. And he did this, first of all, to ensure that there was greater social stability and cultural continuity, because people wouldn't be disinclined to offend against one another by virtue of the fact that they happen to agree or disagree about a particular god. It removes a possible point of contention amongst the people. So the more gods you have, the more factions you have in society, the greater the sectarian conflict and confrontation is going to be, the more divisive your society will be. Akhenaten implicitly, we assume, or assume that he understood that. And so one of the reasons, I don't think it was just a matter of him being, he looked up at the sun one day and thought, wow, the sun is really beautiful. I think everybody should worship the sun. I don't think it was so simplistic as that. I think we should give the guy a little bit more credit than that. I think he understood the importance of the unifying importance of a single monolithic deity that could be worshipped by all people, regardless of what they thought about each other. It was a unifying force. It created solidarity. It created fraternity, because we all believe in the same thing. We all believe the same powers of the same God. And this is the difference between living in a society that is almost exclusively Christian, Calumet, Laurium, Houghton, Hancock, Chassel, etc., versus a society that is riven with sectarian differences and potentially can give rise to sectarian conflict. Iraq, if you live in Baghdad or Basra or post U.S. invasion Iraq. I got to finish this up real quick, guys, because there's actually a storm coming in. It may knock out the power here. I'm just actually looking for excuses to finish this up in the under 2 hour mark, which is probably not going to happen because I got like about a minute left. Um, how did the there's more to number 14 than just that. How did the religious beliefs of the ancient Egyptians foreshadow or prefigure some of the integral dogmatic components of later monotheisms? We're going to discuss the Egyptian conception of the afterlife as well as the innovations introduced by Akhenaten. So what we're talking about here is the idea that there is an afterlife, and you're held accountable in the afterlife for your deeds or your misdeeds in this life. So there's some metaphysical accountability, some eternal accountability, whereby you stand before the God of the afterlife, and that God is going to adjudicate your existence in the afterlife based on how you comported yourself in this mortal life, right? So this incentivizes good deeds. This incentivizes going out there and being generous and gracious and kind and considerate, and comporting yourself in a manner that is consistent with the expectations of society in general. So it provides a motivation and incentivizes good social behavior because it rewards that internally in the afterlife. And that's a pretty good reason to behave yourself, because the opposite of that is a pretty good reason to avoid misbehaving, right? That say that if your adjudication in the afterlife is going to depend on how well you behave yourself in this life, then if you're an asshole in this life, then you're going to end up in a more hellacious version, more torturous and painful version of the afterlife. And the afterlife lasts forever, okay? So that's a pretty good incentive to ensure that you behave yourself in this life. So it confers a certain moral or ethical motivation on people that otherwise wouldn't have it. This goes back to the point that Dostoevsky makes in The Brothers Karamazov. He says, without God, right, all things would be permitted. Now that's, I think, actually a very spurious thing to say, because I don't really think that's logically consistent with the facts of life, the reality of human nature. But the point that Dostoevsky, by the way, Dostoevsky was a Russian writer, philosophical writer, and the point he was trying to make is the same point that Akhenaten would have been making, I think, at this time, which is to say that without the belief in an afterlife, essentially, right? Forget about deity. Let's talk about an afterlife, a deity that supervises us, that vigilates us, that knows what we're doing, and is going to punish us or reward us accordingly based on how we performed. That actually does provide a very strong motivation to conform to the strictures of society. Because otherwise, you just say, if you're a person that doesn't really respect the laws of man, you say, yeah, screw it. I go out there and do whatever the hell I want. And what's to stop you? Unless you believe in an afterlife where you're going to be held accountable forever. That may stop you. I think Akhenaten knew that. And that foreshadows the development of the Hebrew religion, because the ancient Hebrews were the precursors to the Christians. Christianity is just a reiteration of Hebrew scripture. And in Christianity, we have this idea of heaven and hell. And I think Christianity sort of borrowed that idea from the ancient Hebrews, who borrowed it originally incipiently from the ancient Egyptians. So this started with Akhenaten, okay? Now, whether or not he foresaw this, I don't know, but I think he was had enough vision and prescience to understand the implications that all this had. Describe the man of heaven and articulate the ways in which we just talked about this 2 days ago. I'm not going to waste my breath and my time describing it. We just talked about this, and I said a hell of a lot in class, and it's getting really windy outside, and I like to chase storms, so I'm going to close escrow on this and get out in my car and drive around and see if I can find anything interesting out there tonight. Number 17. Describe the feudal system as it was devised and implemented by the Zhao dynasty. Remember to expound upon the reciprocal dynamics between the king and his immediate subordinates and the nobility. What necessitated such a system to begin with, and the responsibilities and privileges of the nobles. We talked all about this. This is that dynamic exchange between the king and the noble. You swear loyalty, obedience, pledge fealty to me as the king. I give you land. I give you whatever is on the land. I offer you protection when, in fact, you need it. Again, like the mafia boss in relation to the clients that come to him and ask for protection. And in return for that, I get your loyalty. I get your obedience. I get you not betraying me when I'm not looking, when I'm not watching you. Okay, that's what I get. Now, how does this relate to the geography of or I'm sorry, what is what necessity the system to begin with? The size of China itself, right? The fact that it's very big. So you need to delegate responsibility to subordinates whom you can rely upon, who are trustworthy, who pledge allegiance to you personally, and they swear not to disavow or disabuse themselves of that oath on pain of everlasting damnation or something of that nature, right? This is not swearing in the Bible, but it's swearing before the gods and taking of oaths, right? A blood oath, if you will, right? This is like the Crips, right? Blood in, blood out. That's your loyalty. That's your duty. Your honor is your loyalty. Okay, that's actually a phrase from Nazi Germany, but actually it works out pretty well. Mein Ehre heißt Treue. And that's what the feudal people would have believed, right? They would have said, my honor is my loyalty. If I have no loyalty, I have no honor. If I have no honor, I'm not a man. And that's the concept and the conception that I think they all had assimilated themselves to. Okay, I'm going to wrap this up, guys, because we are actually now at the 2 hour and 4 minute mark. And I apologize for being as loquacious as always. I hope you enjoyed this. Maybe you didn't enjoy it, but I hope it was at least somewhat helpful. And if it was in any way advantageous and in any way helped you understand this material in a way that you otherwise hadn't, I would appreciate it if you give me a thumbs up. I know I said before I don't care about that, but you know what? I'm becoming more of a narcissist now that I'm on YouTube more often. So go out there, give me a thumbs up, just for the hell of it. Okay, come on. I spent 2 hours sitting here in this janky room. And it's hot in here, okay, and it's uncomfortable, all right, and I could be gaming tonight, but I'm doing this for you guys, all right. I'm doing the study guide for you. If you got any questions, any concerns, any issues, any outstanding issues whatsoever, you know how to get a hold of me. I appreciate your time, appreciate you watching, and I got the wrong mouse because I got 2 computers here and I got to use this mouse to shut this thing down. All right, guys, be safe out there. For God's sakes, be safe. Wear your mask. Avoid Walmart at all costs. And admonish others to also be as assiduous as they possibly can be with respects to mask wearing and social distancing, because if you don't do those things, this thing is not going to go away. And if you continue to not do those, I don't know if it's, I shouldn't presuppose that you guys aren't doing those things, but if people around here don't do those things, this is not going to go away. And you guys are not going to come back to class, which means you're going to have to listen to me on YouTube for the rest of the semester, which I know you don't want it to do. And neither do I necessarily. I actually like, you guys are a pretty good group. So there you have it. All right. Thanks for watching. Take care.